Hey, you're watching Mr.Boocast. Tonight's story isn't a creepypasta, and it isn't an urban legend. It's something that happened to me, one quiet evening when my parents left to visit friends and I stayed home alone, until a message came through that made my hands go cold. Run. Hide in the basement. Turn off all the lights. I'm going to tell it exactly the way it happened. No exaggeration, no jokes. Put on headphones, keep the room dim, and let's begin. Introduction. I remember that afternoon with a clarity that feels wrong, like the memory has a sharp edge I can still cut myself on if I think about it too long. It was a Saturday, the kind of pale winter day where the sky stayed the color of unwashed glass and the light never quite settled. The house sounded louder than usual because my parents were moving through it with purpose. Closet doors sliding, the front hall cabinet opening and closing, the soft jingle of keys being lifted and set down again. Nothing in that movement was unusual, but it had an impatience to it, as if they were trying to leave before the day finished closing in around the house. They were going to visit friends across town. I'd met the couple a few times, polite people with a tidy kitchen and a dog that always smelled like damp leaves. My parents made it sound casual, a quick evening visit, a little food, some conversation, back before midnight. I was old enough to be left alone without it being an event, 17, tall enough that strangers didn't glance twice, responsible enough that my mother stopped leaving written lists on the counter. Still, my father paused by the doorway and looked back at me for a beat longer than normal, as if he was weighing whether to say something and deciding not to. "Phone on?" my mother said, not sternly, just habit. "Door's locked." "Yeah," I told her. "I'm not 5. She smiled like she didn't hear the edge in my voice. The heat in the house was on too high, and I could feel it in the back of my throat, dry and dusty. The living room smelled faintly of the lemon cleaner my mother used on the wood furniture. Outside, the last leaves clung to the branches like they had forgotten what season it was. When my parents stepped out, their coats brushed against each other with that soft fabric scrape that always made me think of being small and tucked between them in a crowd. The door closed behind them. I listened to the deadbolt click, the chain rattle. Through the thin window pane near the handle, I watched their car reverse, stop, then ease forward down the street. The red brake lights glowed at the intersection and then disappeared. The moment they were gone, the house changed. Not in the obvious way, not the way it does when you turn off a TV and suddenly notice the refrigerator hum. It was subtler than that. Like the air had been holding something back while they were here, and now it could loosen. The silence didn't deepen. It rearranged itself. The ceiling seemed higher. The hallway stretched longer. The rooms felt less like rooms and more like separate spaces that only pretended to belong to each other. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had grown up in that house. I knew every creak in the stairs, every spot in the floor that complained underfoot. The faint whistle of wind that always came through the kitchen window if you didn't latch it hard enough. If there was a draft, I could point to its source. If there was a shadow, I knew which tree made it. I did my usual routine. I heated leftovers without really tasting them. I scrolled through my phone until my eyes ached, then set it down and stared at the kitchen clock. The clock had a second hand that clicked too loudly, a sound my parents never noticed but I always did. It kept insisting on time passing, as if time needed help. I moved from room to room without a reason, turning on lamps even though there was still a washed-out light outside. In my bedroom, I opened my window a fraction and let the cold air in. It smelled like wet pavement and chimney smoke. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and stopped, like it had reconsidered. The neighborhood was quiet, in the way suburbs are quiet, soft, contained, padded by distance and lawns and the assumption that nothing much happens here. At around 5, my parents sent a quick message. "Here safe. Dinner soon." "We'll text later," I replied with a thumbs up. It felt like a normal evening. I went back downstairs and turned on the TV for background noise, but the voices on it sounded thin. I kept lowering the volume until it was barely there, and then I turned it off entirely because the silence felt easier than the fake sound. When it started getting dark, I switched on the porch light. Our streetlights flickered on one by one, as if someone was walking along the road and tapping them awake. I locked the back door and checked the latch twice, more out of boredom than fear. I've replayed that small, pointless action 100 times since, trying to find some moment where I could have changed what happened later. The door latch was firm. The frame was solid. The glass was intact. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Around 6:30, I realized I hadn't heard a single car pass in a while. That shouldn't have mattered. But it made the quiet feel heavier, as if the street was holding its breath. I stepped to the living room window and moved the curtain aside by a careful inch. The road was empty. The driveway across from ours was empty too, their family probably out for the evening like mine. The mailbox cast a thin black line on the snowless grass. I let the curtain fall back into place. The fabric brushed my fingertips rougher than I remembered. I tried to distract myself by doing small things, rinsing my plate, putting it in the dishwasher, wiping down the counter. The water ran too loudly. The pipes made a hollow rushing sound that traveled through the walls. When I turned the faucet off, the sudden quiet made my ears ring, and I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for the house to settle again. That was when I noticed the basement door. It's in the short hallway between the kitchen and the back entry, painted the same off-white as the walls, with a metal handle that was always colder than it should be. My parents kept it shut, not locked, just shut. The basement details were familiar. Unfinished concrete, shelves with old paint cans, my father's tools arranged with mild obsession. There was nothing romantic or mysterious about it. It was a basement, a storage space, a place that smelled like cold stone and cardboard. But the door wasn't fully closed. Not wide open, just not latched. The edge was a sliver away from the frame, enough that a line of darkness showed. I couldn't remember going near it since my parents left. I didn't go into the basement without a reason. I didn't open that door absent-mindedly. I walked toward it and felt the temperature change, like the air coming from that crack was slightly cooler. I could smell the basement's dampness through the gap. I reached out and pressed the door inward with 2 fingers. It clicked into place. The handle settled. The crack of darkness vanished. I stood with my hand still on the paint-smooth surface, waiting for the uneasy feeling to fade. It didn't. It clung to my skin, prickly and persistent, like I'd brushed against fiberglass. I told myself my parents must have gone down there earlier and not pulled the door tight. That was all. A normal explanation. A simple mechanical thing. I said it out loud just to hear my voice in the hallway. Must have been loose. My voice sounded smaller than it should have. The hallway swallowed it. I stepped away and turned on the hallway light. The bulb buzzed faintly, an electrical insect sound. Light filled the narrow space, even and harmless. For a moment I felt ridiculous. Then, as I started back toward the kitchen, the light flickered once, only once, a quick dip in brightness, then stable again. That happens sometimes, I thought. Old wiring. I continued moving. I didn't look back at the basement door. The first time my phone vibrated after that, I was in the living room. I'd picked it up again out of habit, scrolling without reading. The vibration startled me because it felt too sharp against the quiet. I glanced at the screen expecting another casual update from my parents. Instead, the notification showed my mother's name and a single-line preview that didn't make sense at first. My eyes skimmed it and my brain refused to process the words like it had decided they were a mistake. The message said, "Run. Hide in the basement. Turn off all the lights." For a second, I truly didn't understand. The words were too blunt, too urgent, too unlike my mother. My mouth went dry, as if the heat in the house had suddenly been turned off. My fingertips went cold around the phone. I stared at the message until the letters blurred. Then, as if time had been waiting for that moment, the house made a soft sound from somewhere deep inside it, an almost imperceptible settling noise, the kind you hear when wood contracts in cooling air. Except it didn't feel like wood. It felt like something shifting its weight. I looked up from the phone and into the dim corners of the living room. The corners looked normal. The shadows stayed where shadows should stay. The windows reflected the room back at me. Couch, lamp, my pale face. Yet my heart began to beat faster. Not from an imagined threat, but from the sudden certainty that the message was real, and that it had been sent for a reason my parents did not have time to explain. I read it again and again. Run. Hide in the basement. Turn off all the lights. My first instinct was to call them. My thumb hovered over the call button. I could already imagine my mother answering, her voice calm, telling me it was a mistake, that she'd hit send in her purse, that everything was fine. I wanted that so badly that I almost did it. But another thought slid in, quiet and stubborn. Why would they text that if they could just call? Why would my mother type all caps, short words, no punctuation except the periods? Why would she write it like an instruction list? And there was something else. Under her name, the small text on my screen showed the timestamp, sent just now. My parents were supposed to be across town, in a warm house with friends, talking and eating. Yet the message felt like it had been pushed through the air from very close, like a whisper delivered right to my hand. I stood up too quickly and the room tilted slightly. Blood rushed in my ears. The floor under my feet felt subtly uneven, as if the house had shifted on its foundation. I took one step toward the hallway, then stopped, suddenly aware of every light I had turned on. The lamp by the couch, the kitchen overhead, the hallway bulb buzzing faintly, the porch light outside. Turn off all the lights. Hide in the basement. The instruction was backwards, unnatural. You don't hide in the basement from something inside the house. You don't make yourself blind in your own home unless the light itself is a problem. My throat tightened. I held the phone up again, as if closer inspection would reveal some explanation. The message sat there, simple and unyielding. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, I realized something I hadn't realized before. Since my parents left, I hadn't once heard the garage door at any neighbor's house open or close. I hadn't heard the usual distant traffic hum. The evening outside had become too still, as if the world beyond my walls had been muted. I listened. The refrigerator hummed. The furnace exhaled. Somewhere a clock ticked. And from the direction of the back hallway, very faintly, there came a sound that could have been nothing at all, a soft, almost polite tap, like a fingertip against wood. Not loud enough to be a knock. Not rhythmic. One single contact, then silence. My skin tightened along my arms. The phone felt slick in my grip. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, forcing my ears to separate normal house noise from anything else. Another tap. This time a little closer. Or maybe I only imagined it was closer because my mind had begun to map danger onto the space. It came from somewhere near the kitchen hallway. Near the basement door. I took a slow step toward the hall, careful not to let my socked foot slide on the hardwood. The living room lamp cast my shadow ahead of me, long and wavering. The hallway beyond was lit but narrower, more confined. The basement door was at the far end, closed, innocent, painted white. The tap came again. Not on the basement door. Not on the back door. It sounded like it came from inside the wall itself, from the hollow place where the staircase to the basement descended behind drywall. A second message buzzed onto my screen before I could think. This time it was from my father. Don't look outside. Do exactly what we said. Now! My stomach dropped. My father didn't text like that. He barely texted at all. If he had to, he wrote in short, normal sentences, never all caps, never urgent. My vision narrowed. The hallway light buzzed a fraction louder, or maybe my ears were amplifying it. The air seemed to thicken, warm and stale. My palms were damp. I knew then that whatever was happening wasn't a prank, wasn't a misunderstanding. Something had frightened my parents enough to break their own habits, to send me instructions that made no sense. And the most unsettling part was that they were not here to enforce those instructions. It was just me, alone in a house that suddenly felt like a fragile shell. I forced my legs to move. One step, then another. My breathing was too loud. Each footfall sounded like a confession. As I reached the hallway, the light above me flickered again, 2 quick pulses, like a warning. The buzzing from the bulb sharpened, then returned to normal. I stared at the basement door, the handle gleaming dully. The tap came once more, this time not from the wall, but from the back door. A soft click against glass, like a fingernail. I froze with my hand halfway to the basement handle. The porch light outside shone through the back door window, casting a rectangle of pale light onto the floor. Within that rectangle, dust motes drifted lazily, undisturbed, as if the air itself was calm. I could see the vague shape of the porch steps beyond the glass. I could see the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. I could not see anyone, but I could feel, with a certainty that rose from some older part of my mind, that if I stepped closer and looked out, I would give something exactly what it wanted: background. I need to explain what our house was like and what our lives were like inside it, because the part that still makes my stomach twist is how ordinary everything was right up until it wasn't. If you'd asked me earlier that week to describe the scariest thing about living there, I would have said the way the radiators clanged in winter, or the way the wind sometimes pushed at the gutters like it wanted in. It was a 2-story place on a calm street, the kind of neighborhood where people waved with 2 fingers from behind steering wheels and complained about the same potholes every spring. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it suggested the kind of fear that gets under your skin and stays there. My parents had bought it before I was born. There were photos somewhere of my mother standing in the empty living room holding a paint swatch fan like a bouquet. My father in the doorway with his hands on his hips, both of them grinning as if they'd just won something. The house wasn't old in the dramatic sense, no Victorian towers or sagging porches, just a late 80s build with beige siding and a roof that always looked slightly too big. The basement was the standard poured concrete kind, unfinished except for a couple of shelves and a workbench my father had built. There was a utility room down there with the furnace and water heater, a narrow door that always stuck because the frame was slightly warped. I'd spent my whole childhood moving through that space without thinking. I knew the way the upstairs hallway carpet changed texture near the bathroom door because of years of wet feet. I knew the exact spot on the 3rd stair down where the wood flexed and gave a squeal if you put your weight there. I knew the basement steps by count, 13, and how the light switch was at the top, not the bottom, so you either went down into darkness or you went down with your hand stretched behind you like you were trailing a lifeline. My parents were not the kind of people who talked about supernatural things. They didn't do ghost stories. They didn't watch those TV shows where people walked around with electronic meters and whispered to the dark. My father was practical in a way that made everything feel solvable. If something rattled, it was loose. If something smelled, it needed cleaning. If something broke, it could be fixed, and if it couldn't, it could be replaced. My mother had her own kind of practicality, quieter but just as firm. She believed in routines, in keeping the house in order, in not inviting trouble by pretending it didn't exist, but also not inventing trouble where there was none. That's why the messages mattered so much. They weren't just alarming because of what they said. They were alarming because they came from people who didn't panic, people who didn't speak in commands unless there was a fire. There had been small things in the months before that evening. I didn't connect them at the time. Looking back, I can lay them out like items on a table and see a pattern, but at the time they were just the kind of minor oddities you forget the next day. Sometimes late at night I would wake up and feel like the house was listening. Not in a poetic way, in a literal way, like the air had become more dense, as if sound moved differently. I'd lie there and hold my breath and listen for a reason. The cat padding around, a pipe hissing, my father coughing in his sleep. The sounds would come, normal sounds, and I'd relax and roll over. But the feeling would leave slowly, not like fear fading, more like pressure easing. Once, maybe 2 weeks before, I'd come home from school and found the kitchen chairs pulled slightly away from the table, all of them at odd angles, as if someone had stood up too quickly and not bothered to push them in. My mother swore she'd left them pushed in. My father shrugged and said maybe the cat had gotten excited and bumped them, even though our cat was old and moved like she was made of careful bones. I remember standing there, looking at the chairs, and feeling a mild annoyance more than anything, like the house was being messy on purpose. Another time, I'd been in the upstairs bathroom brushing my teeth when the hallway light outside the door switched off. Not flickered. Off. I called out to my parents, but they were downstairs and hadn't moved. When I opened the bathroom door, the hallway was dark, and the switch was still in the up position. I flipped it down and up again, and the light came on, steady. My father later said the switch was old and might have a loose contact. He tightened the faceplate screws, like that solved it. I believed him because believing him was easier than wondering why a light would shut itself off. There was also the matter of the basement door. My parents had started closing it more firmly than usual, almost slamming it, like they wanted to make sure it latched. I noticed because my mother usually hated slamming doors. She'd remind me to be gentle, to respect the house. But in the weeks before that evening, I'd hear the basement door bang shut, and then the small metal click as the latch caught, and I'd look up from whatever I was doing and see my mother's face briefly tense, her jaw tight for a moment before she smoothed it away. If I asked if everything was okay, she'd say yes too quickly and then change the subject. I didn't press very hard. I was at that age where you're half in your own world, half still tethered to your parents, and you don't always want to see the cracks in their certainty. My father spent more time in the basement that fall, reorganizing shelves that were already organized, labeling boxes that already had labels. I'd go down once to look for a screwdriver and find him standing still in front of the utility room door, listening, his head tilted slightly, as if he could hear something under the hum of the furnace. When he noticed me, he'd start moving again right away, busy hands, casual voice, asking what I needed. The moment would pass like it had never happened. There was one conversation I can't shake, because it sits in my memory like a splinter. It happened 3 nights before my parents left me alone. I was coming downstairs for water, and I heard them talking in the kitchen in low voices. Not arguing. Something quieter. My mother said my father's name the way she did when she wanted him to take something seriously. I paused on the stairs and listened, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because their tone didn't fit the house at that hour. "I don't like it," my mother said. "It's nothing," my father replied, but his voice didn't sound convinced. There was a pause, and then, "It's probably the neighbor's motion light again." My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Inside our house?" Then I stepped harder on the stair and they went silent. When I entered the kitchen, they were both facing the sink as if they'd been there the whole time, my mother's hands in the dishwater, my father leaning against the counter. They looked at me with expressions that were too smooth, like a mask pulled on quickly. "What's up?" my father asked. "Just water," I said, and my voice came out hoarse. I drank from a glass while they watched me, and I tried to pretend I hadn't heard anything. They didn't bring it up. I didn't ask. The next day was normal. School, dinner, my father watching the news, my mother folding laundry in the living room while the cat slept on her feet. Normal is a powerful thing. It makes you forgive small disturbances. It makes you accept slight discomfort as your own problem. It trains you to ignore instincts because instincts are messy and inconvenient. That evening, after the basement door didn't latch and the lights flickered, my mind reached automatically for normal explanations. I was home alone, so every sound felt louder. I was primed by boredom, so I noticed details I'd usually ignore. The furnace was cycling. The wiring was old. The door stuck sometimes. But my parents' messages broke the normal explanations in half. They cracked something open that couldn't be sealed again with logic. Standing there in the hallway, with my hand hovering near the basement handle, I tried to picture where my parents were. I imagined their friend's warm dining room, the table set, plates clinking. I imagined my mother reading a text she'd typed, my father leaning in. Then I imagined something else. My parents not safe, my parents sending those messages because they couldn't do anything else. The thought hit me so hard my knees went loose. I forced myself to swallow. My throat felt raw. The house smelled suddenly different, like the air had shifted. Less lemon cleaner, more cold metal, more damp earth. It made no sense because nothing had physically changed, but it felt like the smell of the basement had crept upward through the cracks. The tapping at the back door didn't come again right away. That was worse. A repeated noise would have given me something to measure, something to predict. Instead, there was only the possibility of it returning, the uncertainty hanging in the air like a thin wire. I kept my eyes off the window in the back door. My father's message had been specific: don't look outside. I didn't know why, but I obeyed with a kind of desperate superstition. I stared at the basement door instead, the blank paint, the small scuffs near the bottom where shoes had kicked it over the years. It looked like nothing. It looked like a boundary. My phone screen dimmed, trying to save battery, and the sudden loss of light from it made me flinch. I tapped the screen to keep it bright, as if the glow could protect me. 2 unread messages sat there like weight. No further explanation. No, we're coming home. No, call the police. Just instructions. I thought about the basement. Hiding there meant going down those 13 steps into a space with no windows, no easy exit. If something was in the house, I would be cornering myself. But the message didn't say, lock yourself in your room. It didn't say, get outside. It said basement. It said lights off, as if darkness was safer than light, as if being unseen mattered more than being able to see. My hand closed around the basement handle. The metal was cold enough to sting. I felt the vibration of my own pulse in my fingers. For a moment, I just held it, not turning, listening for any other sound. Footsteps, breathing, anything that proved I wasn't alone. Nothing, only the clock ticking somewhere, insisting. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. First irregularities. The door opened without a sound, which was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. It usually made a faint rasp, paint against frame, a soft protest that told you it was moving. This time it swung inward smoothly, as if it had been waiting. The darkness behind it wasn't complete. There was a dull gray presence to it, the kind of darkness that still knows the shape of things. Cool air rolled up the stairs and touched my ankles. It smelled like concrete and dust and something older, a smell that had weight to it. I hesitated on the threshold. My parents' instructions echoed in my head, stripped of context, stripped of comfort. Hide. Lights off. The hallway light buzzed overhead, bright and exposed, making me feel suddenly visible in a way that tightened my chest. I reached back and flipped the switch down. The light snapped off. The buzzing died instantly, leaving a pressure in my ears. For a fraction of a second, the hallway was completely dark. Then the faint spill of light from the living room filled it again, weaker, stretched thin by distance. My shadow disappeared. I felt smaller. I pulled the basement door closed behind me, carefully, gently, until it clicked. The sound seemed too loud in the enclosed space. I stood still, my back pressed to the door, counting my breaths without meaning to. The phone in my hand was the only real light now, its screen casting a pale glow over my fingers and the top of the stairs. The steps descended into gray nothingness. I turned off the living room lamp next, reaching around the corner blindly until my fingers found the switch. The house responded with a deeper quiet, as if something had just noticed me. I imagined the front of the house from outside, dark windows, porch light still on, one glowing eye. I remembered the instruction again and forced myself to go back and turn that off too, plunging the front of the house into darkness. The moment I did, the house felt sealed. Not closed, sealed, like I'd shut myself into something. I returned to the basement door and opened it again, slower this time. The darkness beyond seemed thicker now that the rest of the house no longer pushed light into it. I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down, my phone light barely touching the first few steps. The handrail ran along the right side, familiar and solid. I gripped it and took the first step down. The air changed immediately. It was colder, heavier, and it carried sound differently. My foot landed softly, sock muffling the contact, but I felt the vibration travel up my leg. The second step, the third. I moved slowly, aware of my balance, aware of how much noise I might be making. Each step felt deliberate, like a choice I couldn't take back. Halfway down, I paused. From above, the faintest light outlined the open doorway. Below me was darkness. I listened, straining to separate imagined sounds from real ones. The furnace hummed steadily. Somewhere water moved through pipes, a distant rush like breath. Nothing else, I continued. At the bottom, my feet met the cold concrete floor. Even through my socks, it felt damp. I turned and reached back up to the light switch at the top of the stairs, stretching as far as I could without stepping back up. My fingers brushed plastic, then found the switch. I hesitated for one last second, my heart pounding, and then I flipped it down. The basement went dark. The phone's screen flared brighter by comparison, casting harsh shadows that jumped and distorted. The shelves along the walls loomed, boxes stacked unevenly, their labels unreadable in the dim light. The workbench sat against the far wall, tools hanging in orderly rows that now looked like a display of sharp silhouettes. The utility room door was closed, its warped edge casting a crooked line of shadow. I turned the phone brightness down, remembering the instruction. Lights off. I didn't know if the phone counted. I didn't know who or what might see it. I lowered it until the screen was just barely visible, enough to see notifications, not enough to light the room. In that near darkness, the basement revealed sounds I'd never noticed before. Tiny clicks as the furnace adjusted. A faint drip somewhere, slow and patient. The house settling above me, wood shifting under its own weight. Each sound felt closer than it should have been, as if the walls were thinner down here. I backed toward the shelves and crouched, pressing myself into the narrow space between stacked boxes and the concrete wall. Dust stirred and caught in my throat. I held my breath until the urge to cough passed. My knees ached against the hard floor. The smell was stronger here. Paper, old paint, metal. Time stretched. I watched the phone screen, waiting for another message, for anything that told me what to do next. None came. The silence grew teeth. My thoughts looped uselessly, my parents' faces, the tapping at the door, the way the basement door had already been opened before I touched it. Then, from somewhere above me, I heard it. A footstep. Not the random creak of settling wood. Not the tick of cooling metal. A clear, deliberate pressure, followed by the faint scrape of something being lifted and set down again. It came from the kitchen level, directly over my head. I clamped my hand over my mouth. My pulse thundered so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I stayed perfectly still, muscles trembling, waiting to hear if it would come again. It did. Another step. Closer to the hallway. Closer to the basement door. The sound stopped. Silence pooled thickly, pressing in on me from all sides. I stared at the darkness where the stairs should be, my eyes straining uselessly. Something was in the house. Escalating tension. The footsteps above me did not continue right away. That was the worst part. If they had moved steadily, if they had crossed the kitchen or gone up the stairs or done anything predictable, my fear would have had edges. Instead, there was only the knowledge that something had been there, had placed its weight on my floor, and then had decided to stop. I stayed crouched, my back pressed so hard against the concrete wall that I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes. My legs began to cramp, a slow burn in my thighs, but I didn't shift. I didn't dare. Every instinct screamed at me to become smaller, quieter, less real. The basement felt different now that I knew I wasn't alone. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it felt occupied. The air seemed thicker, harder to pull into my lungs. Each breath had to be controlled, shallow and careful, like I was underwater and rationing oxygen. I listened. The furnace cycled on with a dull thud that made me flinch despite myself. The sudden vibration traveled through the floor, through my bones. For a moment, I thought I'd given myself away, that the sound would be answered by movement above. Nothing followed. The furnace hum settled into its steady rhythm, a false sense of normality layered over something deeply wrong. My phone buzzed in my hand. The vibration was so unexpected that I nearly dropped it. I caught it at the last second, fingers clamping down too hard, the plastic edge digging into my palm. I didn't look at the screen right away. I couldn't. The light, even dimmed, felt dangerous. I turned the phone so the screen faced my leg and shielded it with my other hand, letting just enough glow leak through to read. No new messages. The vibration had been something else, a notification from an app, a meaningless update from the outside world that suddenly felt impossibly far away. Anger flared briefly, hot and irrational, before dissolving into panic again. I turned the phone completely off. The silence deepened. Above me, something moved again. This time it wasn't a footstep. It was a softer sound, more deliberate. The faint slide of something brushing against a surface. Fabric, maybe, or skin against a wall. The sound traveled slowly, stopping, then continuing, like whoever, or whatever, was making it, was mapping the space by touch. I closed my eyes without meaning to, as if that could protect me. In the darkness behind my eyelids, my mind filled the house with shapes I didn't want to imagine. I pictured the hallway, the kitchen, the basement door. I pictured it opening. A soft click echoed faintly down the stairs. The basement door handle. The sound was unmistakable. Metal shifting under pressure. Someone testing it gently, not yanking, not forcing, just checking. I felt a surge of cold sweep through me, starting at my scalp and racing down my spine. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might be sick. The handle moved again, slower this time. I pressed my face into my arm to muffle the sound of my breathing. My teeth chattered once before I forced them still. I could hear my heart pounding, a deep rhythmic thud that felt far too loud in the enclosed space. I was certain the sound would carry up the stairs, announce me like a signal flare. The handle stopped moving. Seconds passed. Or minutes. Time had lost its shape. Then the footsteps returned, heavier now. They crossed the kitchen. I could tell by the pattern of sound, the way the floorboards responded. They moved toward the living room, then stopped again. Somewhere above me, a floorboard creaked under sustained weight, as if someone had leaned down. I had a sudden, vivid certainty that if I made any noise at all, if I swallowed too loudly, if my knee shifted against the concrete, whatever was up there would know exactly where I was. The thought didn't come with panic so much as clarity. It felt like understanding a rule too late. Something brushed against the basement door again. Not the handle this time. The wood itself, a faint scraping sound, like fingertips trailing along the surface. Slow. Curious. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer strain of holding everything in. My muscles ached. My lungs screamed for deeper air. I tasted metal on my tongue. And then, from directly above the top of the stairs, a sound drifted down that made my blood turn to ice. Breathing. Not the distant hum of the furnace. Not air moving through pipes. This was wet, uneven, intentional. An inhale that seemed to hesitate, followed by a long, controlled exhale. It was too close. It was right there at the threshold between floors. I realized with a sick clarity that whatever was in my house knew about the basement, knew about the stairs, knew enough to come to the door and listen. The breathing stopped. A pause. Then, very faintly, a whisper of sound that might have been words, but if they were too soft, too distorted by distance and structure for me to understand. The cadence was wrong anyway. It didn't rise and fall like speech. It slid. My vision swam. Black spots crept in at the edges. I forced myself to take a deeper breath and nearly sobbed at the relief of it. Above me, the weight shifted. The footsteps moved away from the basement door, back toward the hallway. Relief surged through me so sharply it hurt. My body sagged against the wall, exhaustion crashing in all at once. But the relief didn't last, because instead of retreating toward the front of the house, the footsteps turned and headed upstairs. Toward my bedroom. Critical incident. The sound of movement above me climbing the stairs rewired something in my head. Until that moment, the fear had been sharp but contained, focused on the space directly above the basement. When the footsteps turned upward, it stopped being abstract. It became personal. My room wasn't just another part of the house. It was where my clothes were, my bed, the place where my body expected safety without thinking. The idea of something moving through that space felt like a violation of skin rather than walls. The steps upstairs were slow. Each one landed with measured pressure, as if whoever was climbing wanted to avoid the usual creaks. That alone told me more than I wanted to know. The house had noises you couldn't avoid unless you knew exactly where to place your weight. Someone had learned them, or already knew them. I stayed crouched, but my posture changed without my permission. I leaned forward, as if that could somehow shorten the distance between me and the danger, as if proximity could be controlled by attention. My hands shook so badly that I pressed them flat against the concrete to ground myself. The cold bit into my palms, but I welcomed it. Pain was something I could understand. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. There was a pause there, long enough that I could picture it clearly. Someone standing in the upstairs hallway deciding which direction to go. Left toward the bathroom. Right toward my room. Straight toward my parents' room. The image formed unbidden and wouldn't leave. Then the steps turned right. Toward me. Not down the stairs. Toward the room directly above the basement storage area, the room where I slept every night. My chest tightened so hard I had to fight the urge to gasp. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, anything to stop the sound from escaping. Above me, a door opened. My bedroom door had a specific sound. The hinge complained softly before giving way, a small metallic squeal that my father had meant to oil for years and never did. I heard that exact sound now, faint but unmistakable. The door didn't open all the way. It stopped part way like someone peering in. I squeezed my eyes shut again, even though I knew it did nothing. The darkness behind my eyelids felt safer than imagining my room with someone else in it. I pictured my bed, the rumpled blanket, the desk lamp I'd left on earlier and turned off. I pictured the closet door, always slightly crooked because it didn't hang right. Something inside me broke loose then. Not panic, not yet, but a frantic need to know. To understand. To confirm whether this was real. My parents' messages burned in my memory. Hide! Lights off. Don't look outside. They hadn't said don't listen. They hadn't said don't move at all. The sound from above shifted. A soft rustle like fabric moving, then another pause, then something heavier settling, as if weight had been placed on my bed. The mattress springs made a faint, familiar protest. I nearly vomited. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My stomach clenched violently, my throat spasmed, and I had to swallow repeatedly to keep from retching onto the basement floor. Tears spilled down my face without any sound attached to them. I pressed my forehead to the concrete wall and focused on breathing in through my nose, out through my mouth, shallow and controlled. Someone was on my bed. The thought arrived fully formed and undeniable. There was no other explanation that fit the sound, the timing, the weight. The springs creaked again, slowly, as if whoever was there had shifted position. And then came something worse. A sound like fingers brushing fabric. Slow. Exploratory. The faintest scrape of skin against my bedsheet. I shook my head in tiny movements, a useless attempt to dislodge the image. My hands clawed at the concrete without intention. I could feel every beat of my heart, heavy and insistent. My ears strained upward despite me, cataloging every tiny noise. Above me, breathing resumed. This time it was quieter, controlled, as if whoever was doing it knew how much sound they were making and adjusted. The inhale was through the nose, the exhale through slightly parted lips. It was close to the floor, close to where my pillow would be. I realized then that whatever was in my house wasn't searching blindly. It was waiting. Waiting for me to do something. Waiting for me to react. Waiting for confirmation. The thought slid into place with horrible clarity. The lights. My parents had told me to turn them off not to hide me, but to remove information. To make the house less readable. Less responsive. Light wasn't just visibility, it was feedback. Upstairs, the breathing stopped. A new sound followed, one that made my vision blur instantly. A phone vibrating. It was upstairs. The vibration was muffled, distorted by distance and furniture, but it had a rhythm I recognized. Short pulse. Pause. Short pulse. A notification. My phone was in my hand, powered off. That meant the sound could only be coming from one place. My bedroom. Something was holding a phone, or touching it, or triggering it. I felt a surge of desperate clarity then, like a final card turning over in my mind. My parents weren't just afraid. They were reacting to something specific, something that mimicked, something that interacted, something that could stand in a room and wait. The vibration upstairs stopped. A moment later, I heard the faint scrape of something being lifted, a phone being picked up. My lungs burned. My vision tunneled. I pressed my fist into my mouth to stop a sound that tried to tear its way out of me. Above me, footsteps resumed. This time they were lighter, quicker. They crossed my bedroom, exited into the hallway. I heard the hinge of my door again as it opened wider, then the soft sound of it being pulled almost closed, not latched. The footsteps went back toward the stairs. Down. Each step descended with the same careful precision as before, but now there was something else layered into the sound. Purpose. Certainty. It was coming back to the basement. I curled tighter into myself, every muscle screaming. My mind raced uselessly through options that didn't exist. Run where? Scream for who? Fight with what? The basement offered no exits, no hiding places that mattered. I was a shape in a box. The steps reached the bottom of the stairs. They stopped. I could feel the presence on the other side of the basement door, like pressure against my skin. Not touching yet, just close enough to be undeniable. The air shifted, subtle but real, as if displaced by a body. Then the handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. It stopped halfway, resistance met. A pause. Then pressure increased, careful, testing, as if whoever was on the other side was learning exactly how much force was needed. I held my breath until my chest ached. The handle released. Footsteps retreated one step, then another. The weight shifted away from the door. For a moment, hope flared painfully bright. And then something spoke. Not loudly. Not clearly. The sound slid through the door, through the wood and air and stairs, and settled into my ears like something poured. It sounded like my mother saying my name. Not perfectly. Not quite right. The tone was close enough to hurt, the rhythm almost convincing, but something in it was flattened, stripped of warmth. It wasn't calling. It was practicing. My body reacted violently. I clamped both hands over my mouth and rocked forward, a silent scream tearing through me. My entire system screamed to answer, to respond, to go to her. Years of conditioning fought against the terror, demanding obedience. The voice came again, closer this time. More confident. Still wrong. I squeezed my eyes shut and shook my head, hard, as if that could block sound. My parents' instructions echoed through me like a lifeline. Hide. Lights off. Do exactly what we said. I stayed silent. The voice stopped. The basement returned to its hollow quiet, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the furnace. I didn't know how long I stayed like that, frozen and shaking, waiting for the next thing to happen. Aftermath. I don't know how long it took for the house to change again. Time in the basement didn't move forward so much as it sagged. Minutes felt elastic. Seconds stretched thin and snapped without warning. I stayed where I was, folded into myself, long after the voice stopped. I didn't trust the silence. Silence had already proven it could hold things. My muscles eventually began to betray me. The shaking turned into deep, uncontrollable tremors that ran through my legs and arms. My teeth chattered, the sound sharp and dangerous in the quiet, and I had to press my jaw closed until it ached. I focused on the cold of the concrete, on the rough texture against my palms, on anything physical enough to anchor me. Above me, nothing moved. That absence of sound was not relief. It felt like being watched by something that had learned patience. At some point, later, much later, I realized my phone was still off in my hand. The decision to turn it back on felt monumental, like an act that would ripple outward and reveal my position. But I also knew that staying disconnected meant staying alone inside whatever rules this thing followed. I waited. I don't know why I chose that moment over any other. Maybe my fear reached a saturation point. Maybe the quiet shifted in some imperceptible way. Or maybe my body simply couldn't sustain that level of tension any longer. I turned the phone on. The screen lit up weakly, startling in the darkness. I shielded it instinctively, then forced myself to look. Notifications flooded in all at once, stacked and overlapping. Missed calls. Messages. The timestamps blurred together. At the top were my parents' names. I opened my mother's messages first, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The texts were fragmented, sent minutes apart, then seconds. Where are you? Did you hide? Do not answer anyone. Do not come out. It is not us. My father's messages followed. Shorter, more frantic than I'd ever seen. Stay hidden. It uses voices. Police are coming. We are not in the house. The words sat on the screen, stark and undeniable. The last thread of doubt snapped inside me. There was no misunderstanding. No exaggerated fear. What had spoken my name had not been my mother. What had been on my bed had not been human in any way that mattered. I pressed the phone against my chest and let out a sound I'd been holding back for what felt like hours. A thin, broken sob that scraped my throat raw. I bit down on it quickly, terrified it might carry upward, but it escaped anyway, a leak in a system under too much pressure. Nothing answered it. Minutes passed. Then more. My parents sent another message telling me to stay where I was, that officers were sweeping the neighborhood, that I should not respond to any sound, any voice, any knock. They said the front door had been forced when police arrived. They said the back door was unlocked. I stared at that last detail for a long time. Unlocked. I hadn't unlocked it. The first unmistakable sound of outside intervention was not sirens. It was radios. Muffled voices speaking in clipped, controlled tones. Flashlights cutting lines of light through windows above me, the beams shifting and crossing like something methodical and alive. The house reacted to that presence differently. The silence loosened. The air felt less compressed. I stayed hidden until someone called my name from the top of the basement stairs and followed it immediately with details only my father would know. My middle name, the stupid nickname he'd used when I was little, the exact phrasing he used when he wanted me to calm down. Even then, I didn't move until I heard multiple voices, until I saw light spill down the stairs, until my phone buzzed with my mother's message telling me it was really them. When I finally stood, my legs nearly gave out. The climb up the stairs felt unreal, like walking into a memory instead of a space. The basement door was open wide. The hallway lights were on. The house looked violated, drawers pulled out, doors ajar, my bedroom a ruin of disturbed sheets and scattered belongings. There was no sign of anyone else. The police asked questions. My parents answered most of them for me. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like my mother's detergent, and stared at the wall while strangers moved through my house. They found fingerprints that didn't match anyone we knew. They found marks on the inside of the basement door, faint smudges where something had pressed and withdrawn. They found nothing else they could explain. No one ever told us exactly what they thought had happened. The word person was used. So was suspect. There were suggestions of someone hiding, of a break-in gone wrong, of stress and fear filling in gaps. Those explanations were offered gently, like favors. We moved out less than a month later. The house sold quickly. I don't know to whom. I never looked it up. I don't stay alone in houses anymore. I don't sleep with doors open. I don't trust voices in the dark, no matter how familiar they sound. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and the air feels too still, I remember the way my name sounded through the basement door, almost right, almost convincing. And I don't answer. Story 2. A Call from My Own Number. Introduction. The first time it happened, I was standing in my kitchen with the refrigerator door open, staring at a half-empty carton of milk like it contained an answer. It was late enough that the apartment felt paused. No traffic surge outside, no neighbor's television bleeding through the walls, just the low mechanical breathing of the fridge and the dull, steady hum of the building settling into night. I had been awake too long, but not in the dramatic way people describe insomnia. It was the ordinary kind, a stretched workday, a late train, the small chores that pile up until your hands keep moving even when your head wants to shut down. I'd washed a few plates, wiped the counter, checked that the front door was locked twice without remembering doing it the first time. The light above the sink had that faint flicker it always had, a tiny stutter in brightness that my landlord insisted was normal. My phone was on the table behind me, face up, the screen dark. I wasn't expecting calls. The people who called me at night were limited to my mother when she forgot the time difference, or my manager if something at the office went wrong. Neither of them called after 10 unless it was urgent. That night wasn't supposed to be urgent. It was supposed to be forgettable. The ringtone cut through the room so sharply that I flinched hard enough to bump the fridge shelf. A bottle clinked against glass. The sound lingered after the ring stopped, like a small echo in my bones. I shut the fridge and turned, already annoyed at how loud the phone sounded in the quiet. The screen had lit up. A call. Unknown, I assumed, because it was always unknown when it wasn't someone I'd saved. Then my eyes focused and the irritation turned into something else, something that tightened behind my ribs. The caller ID showed my own number. At first my brain tried to correct it. I thought maybe I was misreading the digits, that the light glare on the glass had shifted them. I stepped closer, leaned over the table. The number on the screen was mine. Country code, spacing, the same formatting that always appeared at the top of my messages. My own name was displayed too, the contact card I'd never bothered to customize beyond me. I stood there for an extra beat, as if the phone might realize it had made a mistake and fix itself. It kept ringing. My skin prickled along my forearms. The apartment felt suddenly too quiet, as if everything that could make sound had agreed not to. The fridge hum seemed to recede. I could hear the faint buzz of electricity in the ceiling light, the soft ring of blood in my ears. There are simple explanations for most strange things on a phone. Spoofing, glitches, contact syncing problems. I knew that. I'm not reckless, and I'm not the kind of person who believes the world is arranged to deliver me mysteries. But standing there with my own number pulsing on the screen, those explanations felt distant and theoretical, like reading about a storm while watching your own windows bow inward. The phone rang a final time and then stopped. The screen went dark. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. My first impulse was to laugh it off, to call it back and see what happened, the way you test a loose step by putting your weight on it again. But I didn't. I picked the phone up and stared at the lock screen. No missed call notification, just the standard banner, call ended. My fingers felt clumsy, slightly numb. I opened the call log. The entry was there. Incoming call. My number. Duration 0:00. I set the phone back on the table and looked around the kitchen as if the room might offer an explanation. The blinds were down. The window was a dark rectangle reflecting my own face, pale, tired, suddenly more alert than I wanted to be. The hallway beyond the kitchen was unlit, a long corridor of shadow leading to the bedroom and bathroom. I'd left that light off to save electricity, telling myself I didn't need it because I knew the layout by memory. For the first time that night, the dark hallway felt less like a normal absence of light and more like an unobserved space, a place where something could be happening without my permission. I turned the hallway light on. The bulb came up warm and steady, throwing bland yellow across the floorboards. The normality of it should have calmed me. Instead, it made the strange call feel sharper, like a stain on a clean shirt. I told myself it was probably a scammer using a number spoofing service. It was happening more often these days. People got calls from their own numbers, from government agencies, from neighbors. There were whole threads online about it. The rational part of my mind grabbed that explanation and held it close like a rail on a steep staircase. Then my phone rang again. The sound was the same, but my body reacted differently. The shock was gone. In its place was a cold, immediate dread, like the moment you realize a door you just locked is still swinging slightly open. The screen lit. My number. Again. This time I didn't hesitate. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to reclaim control, to force the situation into something solvable. Maybe because the logic in my head insisted that not answering was the same as letting it grow. Or maybe because in that split second, I imagined my mother calling from some strange device, needing help, and the only identifier available was my own contact card. I swiped to answer. I raised the phone to my ear. The glass was cool. My palm was damp. For a moment, there was nothing. No background noise, no call center murmur, no recorded greeting. Just a blank, pressurized silence that made my eardrum feel slightly tense, like it was bracing. Then I heard breathing. It was very faint, as if the microphone was covered by fabric. A slow inhale. A careful exhale. It sounded close to the phone. Too close, like someone holding it against their lips instead of their ear. My throat tightened. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask who this was, what they wanted, why my number was on the screen. Before any sound came out of me, a voice whispered from the speaker. It was my voice. Not exactly the voice I hear in recordings. No one's voice in a recording ever matches the one you think you have in your head, but close enough that my stomach dropped. The cadence was mine. The slight roughness on certain consonants. The way I undercut the end of sentences when I'm tired. It was intimate in a way that made my skin crawl, like hearing your own name spoken by someone who shouldn't know it. The whisper was barely audible, like it was coming from the other side of a door. Don't answer, 2 words. Soft. Controlled. Not panicked. Not a joke. It didn't sound like a warning shouted from far away. It sounded like someone leaning in close telling you a rule. My hand tightened around the phone. The edges bit into my fingers. I pulled it away from my ear and stared at the screen as if seeing it could change what I'd just heard. The call timer was running. 0 minutes, 3 seconds. 0 minutes, 4 seconds. 0 minutes, 5 seconds. I brought it back to my ear, not because I wanted to, but because my body was doing things without waiting for my permission. Hello, I said, and my own voice sounded thin in the kitchen air. On the line, the whisper came again, closer now, as if the speaker had moved their mouth directly to the microphone. Don't answer. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The kitchen seemed to shrink around me, the walls moving a fraction inward, the ceiling lower. The fridge hum returned abruptly, louder than it had been, and the sound of it made me flinch because it reminded me how quiet the call itself was. The whisper had no room tone, no echo, no environment. It was like sound pulled out of a vacuum. I swallowed. The motion was loud in my own skull. Who is this? I managed. There was a pause, a shift of breath, and then, very softly, my voice said my name the way I say it when I'm checking voicemail, flat, practical, without emotion. It wasn't a question. It was identification. My knees went loose. I leaned my hip against the counter to steady myself. The countertop was cool through my clothes, grounding in a way nothing else was. The line went dead. The phone emitted the small, polite beep of a call ending. The screen returned to the home view. Bright icons on a background photo of a beach I'd never visited. Ordinary. Ridiculous. For several seconds I didn't move. I kept the phone in my hand, staring at it as if it might ring again the instant I set it down. When I finally lowered it, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. My whole body was sweating, but my hands were cold. My shirt clung damply at my lower back. A thin shiver ran through me even though the apartment was warm. I looked at the call log again. There it was. My number. Incoming! Duration 011. A small detail, but it mattered. Next to the entry, the phone displayed the label it uses for saved contacts. My name. As if I had called myself and then hung up. I set the phone on the table and backed away from it, 1 step at a time, like it might bite. From the hallway, the air felt different. Not a draft, not a smell. Just a subtle sense that the apartment's normal boundaries had become uncertain. The light in the hallway was on. The bedroom door was closed. The bathroom door was open a crack. Everything looked exactly like it should, but my ears kept waiting for the ringtone again, as if the sound had marked me. I should have called someone right then. A friend. My mother. The police even, if I wanted to sound ridiculous and be treated accordingly. I didn't. I stood in my kitchen and listened to the silence, the way you listen to a stranger behind your door, trying to decide if they're going to leave or come in. When the phone rang a 3rd time, I didn't jump. I froze. The screen lit up bright in the dim kitchen. My number. And this time, under it, there was a new line of text that hadn't been there before. A short notification, like the phone was describing the call in plain language. Call from me. My stomach turned so hard it felt like my insides shifted. The ringtone kept going, steady and patient, as if whoever was calling knew exactly how long they could let it ring before I broke. I stared at it and, without meaning to, I whispered the words I'd just heard on the line, repeating them like a prayer I didn't believe in. Don't answer. Background. Before that night, my relationship with my phone was the same as everyone else's, constant, casual, and mostly thoughtless. It was the first thing I touched in the morning and the last thing I checked before sleep. I used it for train times, work emails, grocery lists, two-factor codes, the small, quiet reassurance of seeing someone's typing bubble appear and then disappear. It lived on my palm the way keys live in a pocket, something you don't notice until it's missing. I'd had the number for years. It was tied to everything: my bank, my landlord, my doctor, the building's intercom system, my mother's anxious habit of checking in when she couldn't reach me. I'd never changed it because changing it meant cleaning up all the digital threads that number held together. It wasn't just contact information. It was an identity tag, a way the world reached me without knowing where I was. The apartment I lived in then wasn't special. One bedroom, narrow kitchen, a living room that doubled as my workspace when I didn't want to stay late at the office. The building was old enough to have quirks, but not old enough to be charming. Pipes clicked. The elevator groaned. The hallway carpet always smelled faintly of detergent and damp shoes, no matter what season it was. My neighbors were polite in the way people are when they share walls and don't want trouble. Nods in passing, short conversations about packages left in the lobby, silence the rest of the time. I was living alone for the first time in a way that felt permanent. Not temporary until I find a roommate, not a sublet for a few months. I paid the rent. I signed the lease. I kept the place clean enough that I didn't feel ashamed if someone dropped by. I'd built routines around it. Lights off when I left. Door locked twice. Keys in the same bowl. Shoes by the entry mat. The small rituals that make a space feel owned. Work was ordinary, which is to say it was exhausting in a quiet, unheroic way. I did administrative work for a small company that liked to call itself a startup, even though most of the staff had been there for years. Long hours, lots of emails, the constant low-level pressure of being reachable. I wasn't important enough to have anyone tracking me, but I was connected enough that my phone never fully rested. Even on weekends, my manager might send something labeled "quick question," and if you ignored it, Monday punished you. The week before the first call from myself, there were a few small incidents I didn't connect at the time. I'd missed a call from an unknown number while I was on the train. When I checked voicemail later, there was nothing, no message, no automated hang-up tone. Just 10 seconds of dead air. I deleted it without thinking. 2 days after that, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize that simply read, "Wrong person." No name, no context. I ignored it. A minute later, another text from the same number. "Sorry." I blocked it and forgot. That same evening, I tried to log into my email and got a notification that a password reset had been requested. It wasn't unusual. Spam and phishing were constant background noise. I changed my password, enabled extra security, and moved on. It felt responsible. It felt like closing a window. Looking back, what unsettles me isn't that these things happened. It's that they were the kind of things that happened to anyone. They were small enough to live in the cracks of a normal week. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make you call the police or warn friends. They were only signals in hindsight, and hindsight is a cruel way to build meaning. On the day of the call, I had been out in the city in the cold, surrounded by people and sound. I remember the sensation of coming back into my apartment building and feeling the shift, how the lobby was warmer, how the air smelled faintly like old paint and someone's laundry, how the door clicked shut behind me and the street noise softened. I took the elevator up. The fluorescent light inside it buzzed. A stranger shared the ride with me, eyes fixed on the floor indicator, silent. We stepped out on our separate floors without looking at each other, the way you do when you want to keep your boundaries intact. Inside my apartment, I tossed my coat over the chair and left my shoes by the mat. I heated leftover pasta and ate it standing at the counter because I didn't want to dirty a plate. I watched the news without absorbing it. The anchor's voice filled space more than it provided information. I answered 2 work emails I shouldn't have answered. I told myself it would make Monday easier. It didn't. At some point, I noticed my phone battery was lower than it should have been. I'd charged it in the morning. I hadn't been on it much. Still, it hovered in the red. I plugged it in and watched the little lightning icon appear, a small sign of control. I didn't think about it again. My contact list was a mess, like most people's. Names with old numbers, numbers with no names, work contacts that existed only because I'd once taken a call in the hallway and saved it quickly. My own number was saved too. I'd done it years before for a stupid reason. Testing something on a friend's phone, needing to text myself a link, verifying a form. I'd labeled it me and never deleted it. It sat there like a spare key you forget you have until you need it. There's a concept people talk about online, number spoofing, where a caller can make it look like they're calling from a different number. Banks, government offices, local area codes, whatever will get you to pick up. I knew about it. I'd read warnings. My company even sent a memo once reminding us not to trust caller ID. It was all very practical. Don't give out information, hang up and call back through official channels, report suspicious calls. Knowing about it didn't prepare me for seeing my own number on the screen. Even after that second call ended and the line went dead, part of me still clung to the spoofing explanation. It was the only way to keep the experience inside the boundaries of the real. Someone can fake a number. Someone can play a recording. Someone can find your voice online, rip it from a video, stitch it into a whisper. There were services that could do that now, people said. Technology moves faster than caution. But there was something about what I heard that didn't feel like a recording. It wasn't polished. It wasn't clean. It had a slight tremor to it, like breath passing over teeth. And it matched the way my voice sounded in my head, closer than any voicemail or video ever had. That detail bothered me in a physical way. It made my stomach tighten. It made my scalp feel faintly itchy, like a warning signal. After the third call started ringing, I didn't answer. I stood over the table watching the screen like it was a living thing. My apartment felt suddenly less private. The walls, the door, the locked windows, none of them mattered if the call was coming from a place the lock couldn't touch. I thought about turning the phone off and leaving it off. I thought about calling my mother and making my voice sound normal so she wouldn't worry. I thought about messaging a friend, but the idea of typing out, "My phone is calling me," felt stupid in a way that made me angry. Not because it wasn't true, but because it sounded like a story, like a setup, like the beginning of something people would laugh at. Instead, I did what I always did when I didn't know what to do. I tried to gather information. I screenshot the call screen. I checked my carrier app. I refreshed the call log. I looked at the entry again and again as if numbers could rearrange themselves into meaning. I even tried dialing my own number from my phone, half expecting it to connect me to the same whisper. It went straight to voicemail, my own recorded greeting playing back at me with its familiar awkwardness. Hearing my recorded greeting after hearing that whisper made my skin crawl. The greeting was obviously me, the public version of my voice. The whisper had been something else, me shaped into a warning, stripped down to its most intimate tone. When the phone finally stopped ringing, I realized my whole body was tense. My shoulders were up near my ears. My jaw ached from clenching. The kitchen light seemed harsher. The shadows in the hallway felt deeper. The apartment was the same space, but my sense of it had shifted, like a map redrawn, when you learn a road is unsafe. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the phone on the mattress beside me, screen down, volume low, waiting for it to ring again. Each time the building made a normal noise, a pipe click, a neighbor's door closing, a car passing outside, I felt my nerves jump as if something had reached for me. Sometime after midnight, I checked the call log again, hoping the entries would vanish or be replaced by something that made sense. They were still there. 3 calls, all from me, all unanswered, except the one where I had heard my own voice whisper, "Don't answer." And the part that kept repeating in my mind wasn't the words. It was the implication. If I shouldn't answer, then who was I answering when I did? First, irregularities. The next morning didn't bring relief. That was the first thing that told me this wasn't going to fade on its own. I woke up with that heavy, sour feeling behind my eyes that comes from shallow sleep, The kind where your body rests, but your mind never fully lets go. My phone was still on the bed beside me, exactly where I'd left it. The screen was dark. No missed calls. No notifications. For a few seconds, I lay there staring at the ceiling, convincing myself that the night before had been exaggerated by exhaustion. Memory does that sometimes. It stretches moments, sharpens edges, fills silence with meaning. Then I reached for the phone. The call log was unchanged. 3 incoming calls, all from my number. 1 answered. Duration 11 seconds. Seeing it in daylight didn't make it less disturbing. In fact, it felt worse. Night gives fear permission. Morning is supposed to take it away. Instead, the sunlight coming through the blinds made everything too clear, too ordinary. The contrast made the calls feel out of place, like something that had followed me out of a dream and refused to leave. I went through the rest of the morning on autopilot. Showered. Dressed. Made coffee I barely tasted. The sound of water in the pipes, the clink of the mug against the counter, the hum of the kettle. All of it felt slightly amplified, like my senses were tuned a notch too high. Every vibration in my pocket made my heart jump, even when it was just my leg brushing the fabric. On the train to work, I watched people scroll through their phones with the same blank focus I probably wore. No one looked afraid. No one looked like they were questioning whether the device in their hands might suddenly turn against them. The ordinariness of it all made me feel isolated in a way I couldn't explain. At work, I tried to act normal. I answered emails. I nodded through a meeting. I laughed at a joke I didn't hear. But every time my phone lit up on the desk, my stomach clenched. I checked the screen too quickly, too obviously. A coworker noticed and asked if everything was okay. I said I hadn't slept well. That was true, but it wasn't the reason. Around noon, I decided to call my carrier. I didn't expect much. I just needed to hear someone say the right technical words, the kind that shrink fear into a problem with steps and solutions. The customer service rep was polite, bored, efficient. She put me on hold twice. She asked me to verify my identity. She read from her script. According to her system, there was nothing unusual. No outgoing calls from my number to itself. No flagged activity. No reports of spoofing connected to my account. She suggested the call log might be a temporary display error and recommended restarting my phone. I did. Twice. The calls stayed. When I asked if it was possible for someone to make it look like my number was calling me, she said yes, technically, but added that it was rare and usually associated with large-scale scam operations, not single-targeted calls. She said if it happened again, I should ignore it. Ignore it. I thanked her and hung up, feeling worse than before. The conversation had removed the comfort of known glitch without replacing it with anything solid. If the system didn't see the calls, then whatever had reached me had done so without leaving a trail that mattered. That afternoon, I noticed the first small behavioral change in myself. I stopped answering unknown numbers entirely. That wasn't unusual on its own, but I also stopped answering numbers I did recognize, at least not right away. I watched them ring, waited for voicemail, listened to the tone of the vibration instead of trusting the name on the screen. Caller ID had lost its authority. A name meant nothing if my own could be used against me. When I got home that evening, the apartment felt different again. Not hostile, just alert, like a room after someone leaves abruptly, furniture still holding the impression of movement. I locked the door and stood there longer than necessary, listening. Nothing. I cooked dinner with the TV on louder than usual, not because I wanted to watch it, but because silence had started to feel dangerous. The anchor's voice filled the space, flattened it, made it less flexible. I kept my phone face down on the table. At 8:17 p.m., it vibrated. I didn't touch it. The vibration stopped. A second later, it started again, longer this time, insistent. I flipped the phone over. Missed call. From my number. No ringtone this time. Just the vibration. As if whoever or whatever was calling had adjusted. My throat went dry. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, then brightened again with a second incoming call. My number. I stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound made me flinch, and I froze, suddenly aware of how alone I was in the apartment. The TV continued talking, oblivious. I didn't answer. The call stopped on its own. Seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. My hands shook as I opened it. The file length showed 3 seconds. I held the phone away from my ear at first, then forced myself to bring it closer. The voicemail played automatically. There was no background noise. No greeting. Just my voice, low and breath close, the same intimate whisper from the night before. Don't. One word. Then silence. The voicemail ended. I dropped the phone onto the table like it had burned me. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. My skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Not seen exactly, but tracked. Like something had learned how to reach me and was testing the limits. I deleted the voicemail. It stayed in the deleted folder. I deleted it again. It came back. That was the moment the fear stopped being sharp and became something heavier. More patient. Whatever this was, it wasn't random anymore. It was responsive. And it knew I was listening. Escalating tension. After the voicemail, I stopped pretending this was a technical problem. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't frame it as a realization. It was more like a quiet internal shift, the way your body adjusts when you realize a pain isn't temporary. The explanations I'd been holding on to, spoofing, glitches, bored scammers, lost their usefulness. They no longer reduced the fear. They just sat there, thin and fragile, unable to support the weight of what was happening. That night, I didn't turn the lights off. I left every lamp on in the apartment, even the small one in the hallway that I usually never used. The place looked overlit and artificial, shadows pushed flat against the walls. It should have felt safer. Instead, it felt exposed, like I'd made myself visible in a way I couldn't undo. I kept the TV on low volume as well. Not loud enough to follow, just enough to break the silence into pieces. Every time a commercial came on and the tone shifted abruptly, my body tensed as if something had moved behind me. I slept on the couch with the phone on the coffee table, screen facing up. I didn't plug it in. I didn't want it connected to anything. I don't know why I thought that might matter, but it did. It felt like drawing a line, even if the line was imaginary. Sometime after 2 a.m, I woke up because the room felt wrong. There was no sound that triggered it. No vibration. No noise from outside. Just a sudden, sharp awareness, like my body had been nudged awake by something it couldn't name. My eyes opened and fixed on the phone immediately. The screen was dark. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The building made its normal nighttime noises. A distant elevator moving, pipes shifting, someone's footsteps far down the hall. Each sound registered clearly, distinctly. Nothing overlapped. Nothing extra crept in. I told myself to breathe. Slow. Quiet. That's when the phone screen lit up. No ringtone. No vibration. Just the glow. A notification banner appeared at the top. Missed call, me. Timestamp, 2:14 a.m. I hadn't heard it ring. My heart began to pound so hard it made my vision pulse. I reached for the phone and stopped halfway, my hand hovering in the air. I was suddenly afraid of touching it, like contact might complete something that had started without my consent. I picked it up anyway. The call log showed the entry clearly. Duration, 0:00. Incoming, my number. Below it, another entry I hadn't noticed before. Outgoing call, me, 2:14 a.m. Duration, 0 minutes 2 seconds. I stared at it until the words blurred. According to my phone, I had called myself. While I was asleep. A cold wave moved through me, starting at my chest and spreading outward, leaving my fingers numb. I checked the time. I checked the date. I checked my screen time statistics, my activity log, anything that could tell me my phone had been unlocked. Nothing. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't moved. I hadn't dreamed, at least not that I could remember. The apartment felt suddenly unfamiliar, like I'd woken up somewhere similar but not identical to the place I knew. I scanned the room slowly. The door was still locked. The chain was in place. The windows were shut. The lights were on, humming softly. Everything looked controlled. That scared me more than chaos would have. The next day blurred at the edges. I called in sick to work and didn't explain why. My voice sounded wrong when I left the message. Strained, brittle, like it might crack if I pushed it too hard. I spent the morning pacing the apartment, checking my phone every few minutes, half expecting it to light up again, half dreading the moment it would. I tried turning the phone off completely. For a while it helped. The screen stayed black. The apartment felt marginally quieter, like a machine had been powered down. I told myself that was proof. No phone, no calls. Then, around noon, the phone turned itself back on. I was standing in the kitchen when I heard the startup chime. The sound was soft, familiar, and utterly wrong in that moment. I spun around and saw the screen glowing on the counter, the lock screen fully lit. No notification explained why it had powered up. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the edge of the counter to stay steady. I picked the phone up and immediately checked the call log. 2 new entries. Incoming. My number. Outgoing. My number. Both time-stamped while the phone had supposedly been off. I felt a tight pressure behind my eyes, the warning ache of a headache that wasn't going to be mild. I pressed my fingers into my temples and closed my eyes, trying to force my thoughts into something linear, something solvable. This wasn't just happening to me. It was using me. That thought arrived uninvited and refused to leave. The calls weren't random attempts at contact. They were loops, closed circuits, something reaching out from a place that didn't require a second number, a second identity, something that could present itself as me because, in some sense, it already was. That afternoon I noticed something else. My voice sounded different. Not to other people. To me. When I spoke out loud, testing words in the empty apartment, saying my name, counting, reading headlines from my laptop, the sound that reached my ears felt slightly delayed, slightly hollow, like it was passing through an extra layer of air. I kept stopping mid-sentence, convinced for half a second that I was hearing an echo that didn't belong to me. I avoided mirrors. I don't have a good explanation for that decision. I just knew that looking at my reflection felt risky, like it might confirm something I wasn't ready to accept. I caught glimpses of myself in glass and dark screens instead, distorted, fragmented, never quite whole. That evening, the calls escalated. They came every hour, then every half hour. Sometimes they rang. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they left voicemails. Sometimes they didn't log at all, only appearing later as if added retroactively. The messages changed too. No longer just don't. Now it was, don't answer again. You shouldn't hear this. Stop listening. Each voicemail was whispered. Each one used my voice, and each one sounded a little more confident than the last, as if the speaker was getting closer to the right version. By midnight, I was sitting on the floor of my living room with my back against the couch, phone in my lap, lights still blazing. I felt stripped down to something raw and essential, like all the unnecessary parts of me had been peeled away. At 12:41 a.m., the phone rang again. My number. I stared at it, chest heaving, heart racing, sweat cooling on my skin. This time, beneath the caller ID, there was new text. Active line. Connected. Before I touched anything, before I could decide, the call answered itself. I didn't move the phone. I didn't breathe. And from the speaker, my voice spoke clearly for the first time. Not whispering. Not warning. Just stating a fact. You're not supposed to be on this side. Critical incident. The moment those words came through the speaker, something inside me locked. Not fear exactly. Fear had been there for hours, days, maybe longer. This was different. This was the sudden, nauseating certainty that whatever line I thought I was standing on had already been crossed, and I hadn't noticed when. You're not supposed to be on this side. My voice said it calmly, without menace, without urgency. The tone was almost instructional, like a correction made out of habit. Like pointing out a typo, I stared at the phone in my lap. The screen was lit, the call timer counting upward. The speaker icon was highlighted. The call was active. I hadn't touched anything. My hands were resting flat on my thighs, fingers curled slightly inward, nails biting into skin hard enough to hurt. The room felt pressurized, as if the air itself had thickened. The lights overhead hummed more loudly than before, or maybe my hearing had sharpened under stress. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, bouncing off the walls. I wanted to hang up. The impulse was immediate and violent, like pulling your hand away from a hot surface. But something stopped me. Not paralysis. Not confusion. Recognition. The voice on the line wasn't just similar to mine anymore. It wasn't an imitation or a copy. It sounded like the version of my voice that exists only inside my head. The one no microphone ever captures. The one shaped by bone conduction and intention rather than air. The voice I hear when I think. "Who are you?" I asked, and the sound of my own spoken words startled me. They sounded foreign now, less certain, like they belonged to someone else. There was a pause on the line. A breath. Then my voice answered. "I already told you." The call crackled faintly, not with static, but with the sound of movement. Fabric shifting. A body adjusting its position. I pressed the phone closer to my ear without realizing I was doing it, desperate and repulsed at the same time. "This isn't funny," I said. My mouth felt dry. My tongue stuck slightly to my teeth. "This isn't, whoever you are, stop." Another pause. Then, softly, almost kindly, "You answered." A cold sensation spread across my scalp and down my spine, like water poured too slowly. My heart began to pound harder, each beat heavy and distinct. I became acutely aware of my body, the ache in my lower back from sitting on the floor, the sweat cooling under my arms, the faint tremor in my hands. "I didn't know," I said, and the words slipped out before I could stop them. They felt instinctive, defensive. I didn't know what it was. The line was silent long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then my voice said, "That's why it worked." Something shifted in the apartment. Not physically. The walls didn't move. The lights didn't flicker. But the sense of space changed, subtly and profoundly, like a room after someone else enters it. I felt less alone, but not in a comforting way. More like I was no longer the sole occupant of my own position. "What side?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. "What are you talking about?" The response came immediately this time. "The listening side." The phrase landed heavily, full of implications I didn't yet understand. My stomach tightened. I tried to sit up straighter, as if posture could restore authority. "I'm hanging up," I said. "You can," my voice replied. "But you already heard it," I swallowed. My throat burned. "Heard what?" A faint sound came through the speaker then, something like a breath taken too close to the microphone, something intimate and invasive. When the voice spoke again, it was slower, more deliberate. The overlap. The word echoed unpleasantly in my head, not because of what it meant, but because of how familiar it felt. Like something I should have remembered. I shook my head, hard, as if trying to dislodge a thought that had burrowed too deep. "This is just a call," I said. "This is just sound. You can't—" "I can," my voice interrupted gently. "You let me." The lights flickered then. Just once. A brief dip in brightness that made my breath catch. When they steadied, the room felt darker than before, even though nothing had actually changed. My phone vibrated slightly in my hand. I pulled it away from my ear and looked at the screen. Another call was coming in, from my number, while the first call was still active. 2 instances of me overlapping on the screen, one connected, one ringing. My vision blurred. A sharp pain bloomed behind my eyes. "That's not possible," I whispered. On the line, my voice sounded almost amused. "It is now." The second call stopped ringing on its own. A voicemail notification appeared instantly. The call in my ear continued. "You're crossing layers," the voice said. "Most people don't notice. You noticed." "I didn't do anything," I said, louder now, desperation creeping in despite my efforts to keep it out. "I live here. I work. I sleep. I didn't invite this." A pause. Then, "You listened." The word hit me harder than it should have. My chest tightened. I felt suddenly, vividly aware of every moment I had leaned in closer, every time I had replayed a voicemail, every second I had waited in silence instead of shutting the phone off and walking away. "You answered," the voice continued. "You stayed on the line. You let it complete." "What?" I demanded. "Complete what?" There was a faint clicking sound on the call now, like a distant switch being toggled. The voice dropped even lower. A loop, my head swam. I pressed my free hand to the floor to steady myself. The hardwood felt solid, real, grounding in a way nothing else was. "You're still here," the voice said. "That means it hasn't closed yet." My pulse hammered in my ears. Closed what? The gap. The word echoed. Gap. Overlap. Loop. Pieces began to align in my mind in a way that made me feel sick. The missed calls I hadn't heard. The outgoing calls I hadn't made. The voicemails that wouldn't delete. The sense that my voice didn't quite belong to me anymore. "You're not me," I said, and I needed it to be true. The answer came softly. "Not anymore." The lights flickered again, longer this time. The TV, which I'd forgotten was still on in the background, cut to static. The sudden hiss filled the room, loud and aggressive. I gasped despite myself. Through the noise, my voice on the phone continued, steady and unaffected. "You're hearing yourself from the wrong direction." My breathing became erratic. I struggled to slow it, to pull air deep into my lungs, but panic had started to take over my body in ways logic couldn't touch. "I want this to stop," I said. There was another pause. When the voice returned, it sounded closer than ever, as if the distance between speaker and ear had collapsed entirely. "It will," it said, "when one of us stops answering." My phone vibrated violently in my hand. Another incoming call. Then another. My number. My number. My number. The screen filled with overlapping notifications, stacked on top of each other, each one identical, each one demanding attention. The ringtone began to play over itself, distorted and layered, a chorus of the same sound slightly out of sync. I screamed and threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall hard enough to crack the screen and fell to the floor, skidding to a stop near the hallway. The calls didn't stop. The ringtone continued, tinny but insistent, echoing off the walls. The lights flickered in time with it now, brief pulses of brightness and shadow. The static from the TV grew louder, harsher, until it drowned out everything else. I covered my ears and curled forward, my forehead nearly touching the floor. "Stop," I whispered. "Please." The ringing cut off abruptly. The sudden silence was so complete it made my ears ring. I stayed there, shaking, afraid to look up, afraid of what I might see or hear if I did. From the hallway, my phone buzzed once. Then, very softly, from somewhere that was not the phone and not the TV and not the walls, I heard my voice speak again. Not through a speaker. Not through a device. Right behind me. "Don't answer. Aftermath." I don't remember standing up. I only remember the sensation of the floor under my palms changing as my weight shifted, and the way my joints protested like I'd been held in one position for too long. My ears kept straining toward the place where the sound had come from. Behind me, close, intimate. Yet when I turned my head, there was only the empty living room, the bright, indifferent lamps, the TV spitting static. The apartment looked exactly like it had 10 minutes earlier. That was the part that made me feel unsteady, like my body was trying to reconcile two realities at once. The clean, familiar arrangement of furniture and the certainty that something had spoken my voice from a place no device should have reached. I didn't go near the phone right away. It lay on the floor in the hallway where it had skidded, face down. The ringtone had stopped, but the silence after it felt artificial, like the absence of sound wasn't natural quiet, but the result of something choosing not to make noise anymore. I stayed where I was and watched the hallway opening as if something could appear there at any moment without warning, without footsteps. When I finally forced myself to move, it was slow and mechanical. I stepped carefully, not because I expected a trap, but because my body had entered a kind of cautious mode where every movement felt like it should be negotiated. I passed the TV and reached behind it, fingers trembling, and pressed the power button. The static cut out instantly, leaving a hard, ringing quiet in the room. Without the hiss, I could hear my own breathing again. I hated it. It sounded too present, too close, like another person in the room. I approached the phone the way you approach something you know is dangerous, even if you can't define how. I crouched and picked it up by the edges. The screen was cracked at one corner, spidering into fine lines. The glass felt slightly warm, which made no sense because it had been on the floor. When I flipped it over, the lock screen lit. No missed calls. No voicemail. No stacked notifications. Just the normal wallpaper and the time in the center, steady and calm, as if the past hour hadn't happened. I opened the call log with shaking fingers. It was empty. Not empty in the sense that there were no calls ever. My normal call history was there. Old entries from my mother, my manager, a delivery driver. But the entire chain of me calls, every one of them, was gone. No record. No timestamp. No duration. As if I had imagined it all. My throat tightened so hard it felt bruised. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered. Then I went to the photo gallery and checked the screenshot I'd taken on the first night. The screenshot was still there. The image showed the incoming call screen with my own number, my own contact label. The time at the top matched the moment I'd taken it. The evidence existed in one place and nowhere else. That contradiction made my stomach churn. I sat down on the hallway floor with my back against the wall and held the phone in both hands, trying to make sense of a reality that didn't want to stay consistent. I tried dialing my voicemail again, needing something concrete. The call went through normally. My recorded greeting played, awkward and ordinary. There were no new messages. The mailbox sounded clean, untouched. I hung up and sat there until my legs went numb. I kept expecting the phone to ring again, or for my own voice to appear from the speaker like it had before. But the apartment remained quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a room is quiet after an argument when everyone is waiting to see who moves first. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, it wasn't a release. The daylight made the apartment look almost sterile, too clearly defined. Every object had sharp edges. The kitchen counter looked like a stage set, carefully arranged to resemble normal life. I made coffee and didn't drink it. My hands shook too much and the smell turned my stomach. At 7:42 a.m., I called in sick again, then sat at the kitchen table and stared at my phone until my eyes burned. I decided on something I should have done earlier. I was going to replace the phone. Not just wipe it, not just reset it, replace it. A new device, new SIM, new number if I had to. I needed to break whatever pathway had formed, even if I didn't understand the mechanics of it. I left the apartment for the first time in nearly 24 hours and felt exposed the moment I stepped into the hallway. The building corridor smelled like someone's laundry and stale air. The elevator mirror caught my face at a harsh angle. I avoided meeting my own eyes in the reflection. Outside, the street noise hit me all at once. Cars, footsteps, distant construction, and the normal world felt almost offensive in its indifference. At the phone store, I tried to speak like a normal person. I told the clerk my phone was malfunctioning and I needed a replacement. My voice came out tight. I kept clearing my throat. The clerk didn't care. He moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He offered upgrades. He asked me about storage. He asked if I wanted to keep my number. I said no. The word felt like swallowing something bitter. My number was tied to my life, but at that moment it felt contaminated. A doorway I couldn't control. The clerk raised an eyebrow and asked if I was sure. I said yes. I watched him type and print forms and transfer what he could. My old phone sat on the counter between us, face down, like something that didn't want to be looked at. When he asked if I wanted to transfer my contacts and photos, I hesitated. The idea of moving my data from the old device to the new one felt like carrying an infection across a threshold. But leaving everything behind felt impossible too. My hands were sweating. My mouth tasted metallic. I compromised in the way frightened people do. I transferred only what felt necessary. Contacts, calendar, work authentication. I left the voice memos. I left the call log. I left most of the photos. I told myself I could back them up later on a computer. I lied to myself because lying was easier than admitting I was afraid of my own files. I walked out with a new phone, a new SIM, a new number. The first time it vibrated with a normal carrier activation message, I nearly dropped it. My body had begun to react to vibration as if it meant danger. I held it with both hands like it was fragile, like it might turn on me if I didn't treat it carefully. Back in my apartment, I powered off the old phone and put it in a drawer in the kitchen. Then I moved it to a different drawer. Then I put it in a shoebox in the closet. I couldn't decide where it was safest, which was the first clue that safe wasn't a physical place anymore. For a few hours, the new phone felt clean. The silence around it felt earned. I kept checking it, scrolling through settings, confirming the number, confirming that my own contact card no longer existed. I deleted me from the contacts list on principle. I turned off voicemail transcription. I disabled unknown callers. I tightened every privacy setting I could find. That night I fell asleep from exhaustion, not comfort. I left the new phone on the bedside table and put it on airplane mode anyway, as if the absence of a signal could guarantee the absence of an intrusion. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself I was just cautious after a scare. I told myself the fear would fade. I woke up at 3:16 a.m., with my heart racing. The apartment was dark. I'd finally turned the lamps off. The air felt colder than it should have been. My mouth was dry. For a few seconds I lay still listening. No ringtone. No vibration. Just the building's distant noises and my own breathing. I reached for the phone anyway. My fingers found it in the dark. I turned the screen on. Airplane mode icon. No signal. No notifications. Relief hit me so hard it made me nauseous. I almost laughed, but the sound didn't come out. My throat felt too tight to allow it. I was about to set the phone down when a new notification slid onto the lock screen, as if it had been waiting for me to look. New voicemail, 1. That shouldn't have been possible. Airplane mode. New number. Fresh device. No missed call banner. No carrier line. Just a voicemail notification in the clean default font, like a normal part of the night. My hands went cold. I sat up slowly, the sheets whispering against my legs. The room felt too still. Even the silence seemed attentive. I stared at the voicemail notification and waited for it to vanish, for the phone to correct itself, for me to realize I was half dreaming. It stayed. I didn't open it right away. I couldn't. My stomach had clenched so tight it felt like a fist. I turned the phone over, face down, as if that could hide the notification from me. For several minutes I just sat there in the dark with my hands on my knees, breathing shallowly, trying to decide what to do. A rational person would have done the rational thing. Turn the phone off, leave the apartment, go somewhere public, call someone, make it a problem with witnesses. Instead, I turned the phone back over. The notification was still there. I tapped it. The voicemail app opened. One message. Duration, 0 minutes 2 seconds. No number listed. No caller ID, just a blank entry like a space cut out of the system. I hovered my thumb over the play button. My pulse hammered. My ears buzzed. Then I pressed play. For a fraction of a second there was silence. And then my voice whispered, perfectly calm, perfectly close, "Don't answer." 2 seconds. Gone. I dropped the phone onto the bed as if it had burned me. My hands flew to my mouth. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The sound was trapped behind a wall of disbelief and dread. The message wasn't a call. It was not trying to reach me through my number anymore. It was inside the phone. Or inside me, using the phone as a surface. I sat in the dark until the first pale line of morning appeared through the blinds. My body felt hollowed out, as if fear had eaten the parts of me that could interpret normal life. When daylight came, it didn't clean the room. It only made the shapes clearer. I didn't go to work again. I didn't answer any calls from anyone for days unless they texted first and identified themselves in a way that made sense. Even then, my chest tightened every time I put a phone to my ear. The act of listening had become loaded. Dangerous. Like opening a door. I bought a cheap prepaid phone and used it for bank authentication. I left the smartphone at home. Then I started leaving it powered off. Then I stopped trusting off because I'd watched it turn itself on. I told myself I was being paranoid. But paranoia implies an imagined threat. This wasn't imagined. In the weeks that followed, other things began to feel wrong in small, difficult-to-explain ways. I would be in a quiet room and hear my own voice in my head, not as thought, but as sound, like a whisper layered under my thinking. Not words, always, sometimes just the shape of my breathing, an echo that didn't match my mouth. I'd catch myself pausing mid-sentence because I was listening for a second voice inside the first. Once, while washing dishes, I heard my name spoken softly behind me. I turned so fast my shoulder hit the cabinet. No one was there. The apartment was empty. The sound could have been a neighbor through the wall or my mind replaying something, but it didn't feel like either. It felt like the moment right before a phone rings, when the device is still silent but the line is already reaching. I stopped using earbuds. I stopped falling asleep to podcasts. I stopped leaving voicemail greetings. I began to avoid any situation where sound could arrive in my ears without my control. I realized how much of modern life is built on passive listening. Announcements, phone calls, audio messages, even the small background music in stores. All of it began to feel like channels. I tried to talk about it once, carefully, to someone I trusted. I framed it as a harassment issue, a scammer, a stalker who had gotten hold of my voice somehow. The words sounded reasonable as long as I kept them technical. The moment I described the whisper, my own voice telling me not to answer, my friend's expression changed. Not disbelief exactly, more like discomfort, the kind people get when they don't know where to place your experience. He suggested stress, sleep deprivation, anxiety. He said maybe I should talk to someone professionally. He meant well. His concern was real, but it didn't touch the core of it because the core of it wasn't an idea. It was a memory in my nerves. The way that whisper had sounded from behind me, not through a speaker. The way the call log had erased itself. The way the new phone had produced a voicemail in airplane mode. I didn't argue. I nodded. I let him change the subject. I learned quickly that the more you try to make other people hold your fear with you, the more alone you feel when they set it down. Eventually, I moved. Not far at first. Just to a different apartment in a different building, telling myself new walls would mean new boundaries. I didn't bring the old phone. I left it powered off in a drawer and told myself I'd come back for it later. I never did. The idea of touching it again made my throat tighten. For a while, the move helped in the way small changes sometimes do. New routines, new hallway smells, new elevator sounds. The brain likes novelty. It confuses the pathways of memory. I began to sleep in longer stretches. I began to hear my own voice as mine again, most days. And then, one evening, weeks after the move, my phone rang while I was cooking. A normal ringtone, a normal vibration. The sound should have been ordinary, but my body reacted as if it were a threat. I set the knife down carefully, wiped my hands, and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. I stared at it. My mouth went dry. The words "don't answer" rose in my mind automatically, not as thought, but as sound. A whisper without a source. I let it ring out. A voicemail notification appeared a moment later. I didn't open it. I didn't even unlock the phone. I just stood there in the kitchen, staring at the small icon on the screen, feeling the old fear unfold inside my chest like a map. I powered the phone off and left it off. For the rest of that night, I kept expecting to hear my own voice again, through a wall, through a vent, through the air behind my shoulder. I kept listening for it, and that was the cruel part. Even when I resisted the call, I still listened. I still waited. I still gave the thing what it wanted most. I don't know what this side was. I don't know what the listening side meant in any concrete, explainable way. I only know what it did to me. It made me distrust the simplest act of picking up a phone and letting sound into my ear. It turned listening into a risk. And the worst part, the part I don't say out loud even now, is that sometimes, when my apartment is perfectly quiet and I'm half asleep, I can't tell whether the whisper in my head is memory or whether something is still on the line, waiting for me to answer. Story 3. The Forbidden Door in My Apartment. Introduction. For most of my childhood, the door was just part of the hallway. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't disguised. It didn't sit behind a curtain or a bookshelf or anything dramatic. It was a normal interior door, painted the same dull off-white as the rest of the apartment, with a plain metal handle and a thin line of shadow under the frame. If you walked from the living room toward the bedrooms, you passed it without thinking. If you carried laundry to the bathroom, you brushed by it. It existed the way a light switch exists, familiar, unremarkable, not worth attention. But in our apartment, that door had a rule attached to it. Never open it. The rule was older than any explanation I remember. It was there before I understood what never really meant. The first time I reached for that handle, I was small enough that I had to stretch up on my toes, my fingers just barely hooking around the cool metal. I remember the exact sensation. The handle was colder than the air, colder than the other handles in the apartment, like it held on to chill the way stone does. I pressed down and felt it resist, and then my mother's hand wrapped around my wrist. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her grip and the look in her face did everything. "No," she said flatly. "Not that door." I looked up at her, confused and embarrassed, as if I'd done something wrong without meaning to. "Why?" I asked. "Because we don't," she said. And then, softer but sharper at the same time, "Promise me." I promised, because promising was easier than understanding. After that, the door became a kind of blank spot in my mind. It wasn't forbidden in a theatrical way. It was more like a hot stove you don't touch because you touched it once, and the memory sits under your skin. I learned to step around it. I learned not to stand too close. I learned not to let my eyes linger on the handle. When friends came over, I positioned myself so they wouldn't get curious. If someone drifted down the hallway and glanced at the door, I would redirect them with casual urgency, offer snacks, suggest a game in the living room, anything that kept them away from that part of the hall. We lived in that apartment for 7 years. 7 years is long enough for a place to become the shape of your life. Long enough to memorize the floorboards that creak, the way the kitchen window whistled when the wind hit from the north, the exact angle of sunlight that landed in the hallway in late summer and turned the paint slightly golden. Long enough that you stop noticing the smells, laundry detergent, radiator heat, the faint sweetness of my mother's hand cream. Long enough to forget that any of it ever felt new. And long enough, I realize now, for a secret to become routine. My parents never explained the door. Not directly. They didn't spin stories about it. They didn't threaten punishment. They didn't turn it into a big conversation. They treated it like a boundary in the apartment that you don't cross, the way you don't cross into someone else's bedroom without knocking. Except it was worse than that, because the boundary wasn't about privacy. It felt structural, like a load-bearing wall placed in the middle of our family life. My father's version of the rule was shorter than my mother's. If I asked, even casually, he'd answer without looking away from whatever he was doing. "Leave it," he'd say. Sometimes he'd add, "That door doesn't concern you." The words were simple, but the tone made my stomach tighten. Not anger, not irritation. Something like caution held under control, like he had learned to keep his voice steady around something that wasn't steady at all. Over time, the rule stopped feeling like a rule. It became part of the apartment's design, like the way the bathroom light switch was outside the door instead of inside. Odd, but not questioned, because it was how things were. I stopped thinking about it for stretches of months. I could walk past it without my eyes landing on it. Then, in the winter of the 7th year, the knocking started. It wasn't the kind of knocking you hear at the front door. It didn't have that echo of common space, the hallway outside, the building stairwell. This sound came from inside the apartment, from behind the forbidden door itself. It was softer, more contained, like someone tapping from a room where sound didn't travel normally. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the pipes. Our building had old plumbing. In cold weather, the radiators clanked and the water lines made hollow thumps. The noises were unpredictable and sometimes loud enough to wake you. So when I heard 3 muted taps one evening, I barely reacted. I was in my bedroom with a book open on my lap, the kind of quiet night where the world outside feels far away. The taps came and my brain filed them under building noise and moved on. But my body reacted before my brain finished explaining. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. It wasn't rhythmic like a pipe knocking. It had intention. A pattern that felt like someone on the other side of wood deciding what to say. I sat up straighter, book forgotten. I listened hard, suddenly aware of the apartment's usual noises. The low hiss of the radiator, the distant elevator cables, the faint television murmur from a neighbor's unit. Under those sounds, the apartment itself felt unnaturally still. The taps did not come again. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself my nervous system was overreacting to winter silence and old pipes. I went back to my book, but my eyes kept skimming the same paragraph without absorbing it. Every few minutes, I looked at my bedroom door, as if I expected to see someone standing there. That night I dreamed of hallways. Narrow ones. Endless ones. Doors without numbers. A feeling of walking and never reaching the end. In the morning I forgot most of it. 2 nights later, the knocking returned. This time I was in the living room. My parents were there too. That should have made it feel safe. It should have made it feel normal. But the sound cut through the room like a needle. We were watching a quiet show on television, something my mother liked because it didn't demand attention. The lamp beside the couch cast warm light across the carpet. My father had his feet up on the coffee table, a gesture of comfort I always associated with ordinary evenings. The apartment smelled like tea. Then came the taps. Not loud, not violent. Just enough to be unmistakable once you knew where they were coming from. 3 taps from the hallway. From behind the door. I felt my stomach drop so hard it was like missing a step on stairs. My skin went cold. I turned my head toward the hallway without thinking, and my eyes locked on the dark rectangle where the door sat. My parents reacted too quickly for it to be coincidence. My mother's hand tightened around her mug. I saw the tendons in her wrist stand out. My father's foot slid off the coffee table and hit the floor, not loudly, but with a controlled heaviness. The television kept playing, bright faces talking about nothing, but the room's atmosphere had changed completely. No one spoke. The knocking came again. 2 taps this time. Lighter. Almost cautious. My mother stood up abruptly. The tea in her mug sloshed and a drop landed on her hand. She didn't flinch. She walked toward the hallway with the stiff, careful posture of someone approaching a sleeping animal. Halfway there, she stopped. Her shoulders rose and fell once, a deep breath taken for control. My father didn't move from the couch, but his eyes never left her. His face looked different in the lamplight, tighter around the mouth, older. My mother turned back to us and said, very quietly, "Go to your room." Her voice was calm in a way that didn't match her body. Calm like a lid pressed down hard. "What is that?" I asked before I could stop myself. My father's head snapped toward me. Not a sharp movement, but immediate. His eyes were hard. "Now," he said. One word, no argument. I stood up, and as I did, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed felt worse than the sound. The absence of tapping wasn't peace, it was awareness. Like something had been listening and had decided it had achieved something by making itself known. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom with a heaviness in my legs that felt like wading through water. I didn't look directly at the forbidden door as I passed it, but I could feel it on my right side, a presence in my peripheral vision. The line of shadow under it looked darker than usual, too clean and straight. Inside my room, I closed the door and stood with my back against it. I listened. No more taps. Just the radiator hiss and the faint buzz of the hallway light my mother had turned on. I could hear my parents moving softly in the living room, speaking in voices too low to make out, words blurred into a nervous murmur. I waited, expecting my mother to come in and explain, to tell me it was nothing, to give me the missing piece. She didn't. Later that night, when everything had gone quiet again, I left my room and walked to the hallway. The apartment was dark, except for the faint light from the kitchen. The forbidden door sat there as it always had, off-white, plain, perfectly still. I stood a few feet away and stared at it. The handle reflected the kitchen light in a dull stripe. The paint on the door was slightly cracked near the bottom, a thin webbing from years of humidity and temperature change. It looked so normal that it made my chest ache. How could something so ordinary hold a rule that strong? I took one step closer. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. Only my own breathing, too loud in the small hallway. Then, from the other side of the door, a single soft knock answered my step. Not a pipe. Not the building. A knock. Like a response. I felt my body go rigid. My throat closed. My heart hammered once, hard enough to make my vision pulse. The knock came again, gentle, patient. And in that moment, for the first time in 7 years, I understood that the door hadn't been forbidden because of what might be inside. It was forbidden because something inside knew we were here. Background. We moved into that apartment when I was 9, old enough to remember the previous place in fragments. Sunlight on a different kitchen floor, the smell of my father's aftershave in a bathroom with a cracked mirror, the sound of my mother's keys before she even opened the door. The new building was larger and quieter, the kind of post-war block that looked plain from the street and felt even plainer inside. Beige paint in the stairwell, mailboxes that never sat level, a lobby that always smelled faintly of old cleaning product and someone's damp coat. My parents told me it was temporary at first. They use that word the way adults do when they want to make change sound harmless. "We'll be here for a bit," my mother said while she unpacked plates. "Until we decide what's next." My father nodded and carried boxes without talking much. The truth was simpler. Rent was cheaper, the commute was easier, and the building's owner didn't ask many questions. The apartment itself was narrow, a long rectangle with rooms branching off a central hallway. You entered into a small foyer with a closet, then the hall ran straight to the bedrooms at the back. The living room and kitchen opened off the left side, the bathroom off the right, and then, halfway down, was that door. It didn't have a number. It didn't match the other interior doors exactly. The bedroom doors were hollow core, lighter, slightly warped at the corners. The bathroom door had a newer handle. The forbidden door was heavier. The frame around it was thicker, as if it had been installed earlier or for a different purpose. The gap underneath was narrower too. Dust collected there less than it did under the other doors, which should have bothered me more than it did. I didn't have language for it then. I only had the physical impression that the door belonged to the building more than it belonged to us. The day we moved in, I remember trying every door out of habit. Kids do that. They test space by touching it. I opened the bedroom closets, peeked behind the shower curtain, stood in the kitchen, and listened to how sound traveled. When my hand went for that handle, my mother stopped me so quickly she startled herself. It wasn't the speed that stuck with me. It was her expression, the flash of something sharp and unguarded before she covered it with calm. "Not that one," she said. I waited for an explanation the way children wait, patient because they assume answers will come. The explanation never did. Over the years, I built my own, not imaginative ones, nothing like secret rooms or hidden treasure. Practical ones. Maybe it was a storage closet the landlord kept. Maybe it was a sealed-off section with pipes and wiring. Maybe it led to a shared service corridor. In older buildings, there are strange spaces that don't belong to anyone, but are still inside someone's unit. It was easy to believe that. It was easier than believing my parents were afraid of a door. But my parents treated it as if it could change the whole apartment if it opened. When I was 10, I had a friend over from school. We were playing with toy cars on the hallway runner because the living room rug was too nice, in my mother's words. My friend drifted toward the forbidden door and reached for the handle the way kids reach for anything new. Before his fingers touched it, my father's voice snapped from the kitchen. "Hey!" Not loud but hard. My friend froze. My father stepped into the hall with a dish towel still in his hands, eyes fixed on the door, not on us. He didn't yell or threaten. He simply stood between my friend and the door, and the air in the hallway thickened the way it does when adults get serious. "That door stays shut," my father said. My friend laughed nervously like he thought it was a joke. I didn't. I could see my mother in the kitchen doorway watching, her face too still. After my friend left, my father checked the handle. He didn't open it. He just tested it once and then again, like he was confirming it hadn't moved. I started noticing how often they checked it. Not constantly, not obsessively. Just in certain moments, like after they'd had a phone call they didn't want me to hear, or after someone knocked at the front door unexpectedly, or late at night when they thought I was asleep. My mother would walk down the hallway with a folded towel or a basket of laundry, and her eyes would flick briefly to the forbidden door as she passed, a habit so fast you could almost miss it. My father would sometimes stop near it with his keys still in his hand, glance at the handle, and then continue as if he'd remembered something important. If I asked about it directly, the answers were always the same shape, small, firm, designed to end the conversation. "It's just not a room," my mother would say. Landlord's space, my father would add, even though we never once saw the landlord use it. Once, when I was 13 and testing boundaries the way teenagers do, I pressed harder. Then why is it inside our apartment? My father's jaw tightened. He looked at my mother first, a quick glance that felt like a silent argument. My mother didn't look back. She kept washing dishes, hands moving underwater, as if she could scrub the question away. My father said, "Because that's how it was built." It wasn't an answer. It was a dismissal that carried something else under it, warning. There were other small details that didn't fit, details I filed away without understanding. The door had no visible keyhole on our side, only a smooth plate beneath the handle. The hinges were on our side, which meant it opened into whatever space was behind it, not into our hallway. The paint on it was slightly different, more matte, like it had been repainted quickly. And even though the rest of the hallway walls showed the wear of years, scuffs from furniture, faint discoloration where pictures had hung, the area around that door always looked maintained. Not clean, maintained, like someone cared about its surface staying intact. I once asked my mother if we could hang a mirror on that stretch of wall to make the hallway feel brighter. She stared at the spot as if I'd suggested cutting a hole through it. "No," she said. "Just that. No explanation. No argument." Her voice made my stomach tighten, and I didn't ask again. The building itself didn't help. In the first year we lived there, I learned the normal sounds. The neighbor upstairs who wore hard shoes, the couple next door who argued quietly in a language I didn't understand, the elevator cables groaning late at night. The building had its own rhythm, and once you learned it, you stopped reacting. But there were moments when that rhythm slipped. A muffled thump from somewhere that didn't match any apartment. A brief vibration in the hallway floor, like a heavy object had been shifted. Once, I heard something that sounded like a door closing somewhere inside the walls, not the front doors in the corridor, but a deeper, flatter sound, as if it came from within the building's skeleton. The first time I mentioned that to my father, he told me it was plumbing. The second time he told me to stop listening for things. That sentence sat in my mind for years. Stop listening for things. It wasn't stop imagining. It wasn't stop being silly. It was an instruction, like my curiosity itself was dangerous. As I got older, the forbidden door became less about childish curiosity and more about the tension it created in the apartment. It shaped our routines without being spoken. When my parents argued, which happened rarely and always quietly, it happened in the kitchen with the hallway door to the bedrooms closed, as if they didn't want sound traveling toward that part of the apartment. When my mother cleaned, she never scrubbed the forbidden door. She wiped around it, careful, like it was an object that didn't belong to her even though it sat in her home. The 7th year was when everything shifted, and not because of anything dramatic at first. It was a slow accumulation of small stress. My father working later, my mother more tired, money talked about in half sentences. I was old enough to notice what they hid, but not old enough to understand why they were hiding it. I began to spend more time alone in the apartment, coming home from school before they returned, hearing the building settle into afternoon quiet. And then came the knocking. After the second night, after I watched my mother walk toward the hallway and stop, her body rigid with restraint, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. I watched my parents' faces when they thought I wasn't looking. I listened for their conversations behind closed doors. I noticed that my father began locking the front door twice, not out of habit but out of urgency. He would turn the deadbolt, then the chain, then press his palm against the door as if testing its strength. One evening, I came out of my room and found my mother standing in the hallway in front of the forbidden door, not touching it, just close enough that her breath might have warmed the paint. Her hands were at her sides, clenched. She looked like someone listening to a shell. When she heard me, she flinched and stepped away too quickly. Her face rearranged itself into something neutral. "Go back," she said. "What is it?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange in the hallway, too loud. My mother didn't answer. She walked past me and into the kitchen, shoulders tight. A few seconds later, the faucet turned on. Water ran. The sound was sudden and aggressive, like she needed something louder than whatever she thought she'd heard. That night, lying in bed, I listened until my ears hurt. I didn't hear tapping. I didn't hear voices. I heard only the building's familiar noises. But beneath all of it, there was a new layer now. The expectation of a knock, the feeling that the door was not merely a closed surface but a contact point. And the most unsettling part was how quickly my mind began to accept that. By the end of that week, I was no longer asking if the knocks were real. I was asking why they had started now, after 7 years of silence. First, irregularities. After that week, the apartment stopped feeling neutral. Nothing obvious changed. The walls didn't shift. The lights didn't flicker. The door stayed closed, its handle unmoving, its paint unbroken. But the space between things, the pauses, the quiet moments, began to stretch. The apartment felt like it was holding its breath. The knocking didn't happen every night. That was what made it worse. If it had been constant, I could have forced it into a pattern, blamed the building, the weather, anything repetitive. Instead, it came sporadically, with no warning and no consistency. Sometimes 2 nights in a row. Sometimes not for 4 or 5 days. Just long enough for me to start doubting my own memory. The knocks were always the same. Never loud. Never urgent. Always deliberate. Most of the time it was 3 taps. Occasionally 2. Once just 1. Always from the other side of the forbidden door. The first time I heard it while I was alone in the apartment, I was doing homework at the kitchen table. Late afternoon light slanted through the window, dust floating in it. The building was awake then. Elevators running, neighbors moving, doors opening and closing down the hall. I felt normal enough that when the first knock came, my reaction lagged. It took a second for my body to catch up. Tap, tap, tap. My pen froze against the paper. Ink pooled at the end of a sentence I never finished. My heart kicked hard once, then began to race, not wildly, but fast enough that I felt it in my throat. I didn't move. I listened. The sound was muffled by the door, but it wasn't distant. It didn't echo like hallway noise. It was contained as if the space behind the door absorbed sound differently than the rest of the apartment. Like knocking into fabric instead of air, I waited for pipes to answer it. For the building to add its usual commentary. Nothing did. I stood up slowly and took 1 step toward the hallway. My shoes made a soft sound against the floor that felt too loud. I stopped, suddenly afraid of announcing myself. The idea that something might adjust its behavior because it heard me was enough to make my stomach tighten. I stayed where I was, counting my breaths, waiting for another knock. It didn't come. When my parents got home that evening, I told myself I wouldn't mention it. I wanted to see if they would. We ate dinner in the living room, plates balanced on our laps, the television on low. I watched their faces more than the screen. I watched for tension, for listening. Nothing. Just as I began to relax, just as the apartment began to feel like itself again, there it was. 2 taps. Soft. Precise. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. My father muted the television without looking at the remote. No one spoke. We sat in a silence so dense it felt like pressure against my ears. The knocking didn't repeat. It didn't need to. My father stood up and walked to the hallway. He stopped a few feet from the forbidden door, far enough that he wasn't touching it, close enough that I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. He stared at the handle for a long moment. Then he said something I'd never heard him say before. Not now. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It sounded like negotiation. The words settled into me slowly, like a cold spreading under the skin. Not now implied later. Implied expectation. That night I didn't sleep. Every sound felt like it could be the beginning of another knock. The radiator hissed and my body tensed. A neighbor's door slammed somewhere down the hall, and I flinched so hard my heart hurt. I lay on my side facing the wall, as far from the hallway as my bed allowed, trying not to listen while listening with everything I had. At some point, I realized something else had changed. The knocking was no longer the only sound. There were moments, short, easy-to-dismiss moments, when I thought I heard movement behind the door. Not footsteps, not scraping, just a shift. A faint, internal pressure change, like someone leaning their weight against the other side and then pulling back. It was so subtle I couldn't even be sure I'd heard it. But my body reacted every time, a jolt of adrenaline with nowhere to go. I started avoiding the hallway when I was alone. I took longer routes through the apartment, cutting through rooms instead of passing the door. I kept my bedroom door closed more often. I left the bathroom light on even when I wasn't using it, just so the hallway wouldn't be completely dark. My parents noticed. They didn't comment. They also changed. My mother stopped humming while she cooked. My father began checking the time more often, glancing at his watch and then at the hallway, like he was waiting for something on a schedule only he knew. Their conversations became shorter, clipped at the edges, heavy with things unsaid. When they argued, it wasn't about money or work anymore. It was about timing. "You said it wouldn't—" My mother began one night, voice low. "I said we'd manage," my father cut in. "We can't just—" "Lower your voice." They both looked toward the hallway at the same time. The knocking that night came later than usual. Close to midnight. I was awake, sitting on my bed with my knees drawn up, lights off. The apartment was quiet in the way it only gets when the building is asleep. No elevators. No televisions. Just the distant hum of the city filtering through walls. Tap. Single. Soft. It felt closer than before, as if the door itself had thinned. I pressed my palms against my ears, not to block the sound, but to ground myself in something physical. My hands were cold. My skin prickled. Tap. Tap. My heart slammed so hard I thought I might make noise just by breathing. From the living room, I heard my father stand. The floor creaked under his weight. I heard him walk to the hallway, his steps slow and measured. He stopped. I heard him inhale. "Enough," he said quietly. For the first time, the knocking answered him. One tap. Pause. Another tap. It wasn't random. It wasn't mechanical. It was responding. My father didn't move. I couldn't see him, but I could imagine his posture, the way he stood when he was bracing himself for bad news. After a long moment, he said, "Go back." There was no knock in reply, only silence. The next morning, my mother told me to start packing some of my things. Not everything. Just important stuff. Clothes, books, anything I didn't want to lose. She didn't say why. She didn't say where. When I asked, she hesitated, just long enough for fear to show. "We might need options," she said. "Options for what?" She didn't explain. That afternoon, when I passed the forbidden door, I noticed something new. There were faint marks near the handle. Not scratches. Not damage. Finger smudges. As if someone had been touching the door from the other side, pressing where the handle would be, again and again, learning its shape. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the marks, my pulse loud in my ears. I had the overwhelming urge to wipe them away, to erase proof that something had reached for us. Before I could move, a soft knock came from the other side. One tap, right where my hand hovered. Escalating tension. After that knock, so close to my hand that I felt it more than heard it, I stopped pretending I was still a child in that apartment. Something had shifted, not just in the space, but in the way my parents behaved around it. The careful balance they'd maintained for 7 years was slipping, and I could feel the strain in every small interaction. My mother wiped the finger smudges from the door with a cloth soaked in cleaning spray that smelled sharp and chemical. She scrubbed harder than necessary, jaw clenched, breathing shallow. When she finished, she stood there for a moment longer, cloth still pressed to the paint, like she was afraid to pull her hand away. My father watched from the living room. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't help. His silence felt like consent to something unspoken. That night, he moved a chair from the dining area and placed it in the hallway, angled so it faced the forbidden door. Not directly in front of it, offset, cautious. He sat there for hours with a book he never turned the pages of, listening. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked to the handle. I asked him what he was doing. "Being awake," he said. The answer didn't calm me. The knocking continued, but it changed. It wasn't just taps anymore. Sometimes there was a soft drag afterward, like fingertips sliding a short distance before lifting. Sometimes the taps came in uneven groups, 3, then 1, then 3 again, as if testing patterns. Once, very late, there was a sound like a palm pressed flat against the door, held there just long enough to feel intentional, then removed. I began to notice the effect it had on my body. My shoulders were always tense. My jaw hurt from clenching. I startled easily, even at familiar sounds. When I slept, my dreams filled with enclosed spaces and doors that wouldn't open or wouldn't stay closed. I woke with my heart racing, already listening. So were my parents. They slept in shifts without discussing it. My father would stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning, then lie down fully dressed on the couch. My mother would wake before dawn and take over, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, eyes fixed on the hallway. They whispered now, even when the television was on. Even when they were alone in the kitchen, as if the apartment itself could hear. One evening I overheard them arguing quietly in the bathroom with the door closed. "We can't keep pretending," my mother said. "We are keeping it closed," my father replied. "That's what matters." "For how long?" There was a pause long enough that I thought the conversation was over. "Long enough," my father said finally. The knocking answered him that night almost immediately. 3 taps. Firm this time. My mother flinched so hard she spilled water down the front of her shirt. My father stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Not tonight," he said, louder than he meant to. The taps came again. Slower. Heavier. For the first time, I heard something else beneath them. Breathing. It was faint, irregular, like someone breathing through a barrier that wasn't meant for air. It came in short pulls, too close to the door to be imagined. My skin crawled. I felt suddenly aware of the thinness of wood, of how little separated our hallway from whatever space pressed against it. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. "Please," she whispered. I don't know who she was speaking to. The breathing stopped. So did the knocking. That was worse. After that night, the apartment felt occupied even when nothing was happening. The air in the hallway was always colder. Sound behaved strangely there. Voices sounded flatter, footsteps duller. When I passed the forbidden door, I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a mild dizziness that faded once I was past it. I stopped inviting friends over. I told them my parents were strict, that we were busy, that the apartment was being renovated. Lies stacked on top of each other because the truth felt impossible to explain. My parents began packing in earnest. Boxes appeared in the living room, labeled only with vague words, papers, winter, books. My mother wrapped dishes with shaking hands. My father made phone calls from the balcony, voice low, turning his body away from the apartment as if walls could listen. One night I woke to a new sound, not knocking, scratching. It was soft at first, intermittent, like a fingernail testing the surface. Then it became more confident, slow, deliberate strokes near the handle, tracing the outline of where a hand would go. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, sweat cold on my back. From the hallway came my father's voice, strained. "Stop!" The scratching paused, then resumed, higher up the door this time, closer to the frame. I heard my father step forward. Heard his breathing change. "Don't," my mother said, sharp with fear. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. In the morning, there were new marks on the door. Longer this time. Faint grooves in the paint, shallow but unmistakable. Not damage, learning. That afternoon, my father finally told me something. Not everything. Not enough. Just this. If it asks you to open the door, no matter what it sounds like, you don't. I stared at him. "Ask how?" He didn't answer. That night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, something spoke. Not clearly. Not words I could fully understand. A low murmur from behind the door, rising and falling like someone practicing sounds they weren't used to making. My name surfaced once, distorted, stretched, wrong. My mother began to cry silently. My father stood between the door and the rest of the apartment, fists clenched, body rigid, like he was holding a line that could break at any moment. And in that moment, I realized the truth my parents had been avoiding. The door wasn't meant to keep something in. It was meant to keep something from learning how to come out. Critical incident. The first time I heard the latch move, it was so small I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. It was after midnight. The apartment was dark, except for the kitchen light my mother refused to turn off anymore, a thin strip of yellow that reached the hallway and stopped before the forbidden door, like it didn't want to go any closer. I was in bed, fully awake, listening to the building's usual night sounds and trying to separate them from the new ones. My father was on his chair in the hallway again, sitting with his back straight, hands folded loosely in his lap as if he was waiting for a train. There hadn't been knocking for hours. There hadn't been murmuring. The door had been quiet in a way that made my skin itch, the kind of quiet that feels like a pause taken on purpose. I heard my father inhale. Then I heard it. The tiniest metallic click, like a tongue of metal being pressed and released. The handle. Not turning. Not fully. Just shifting, as if something on the other side had touched it with enough pressure to make it respond. I sat up slowly, blanket sliding off my knees. My mouth went dry. My heart began to beat in a careful, controlled way, like it was trying not to make noise. I listened for my father to react. He did, but not the way I expected. He didn't shout. He didn't move quickly. He just spoke low and steady. No. The word carried down the hallway like a command you give to an animal you don't want to startle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the handle shifted again, a little more this time, enough that I could hear the internal mechanism, the faint scrape of metal against metal. My father stood up. I heard the soft creak of the chair. His footsteps were measured, slow enough that I could imagine him placing his weight carefully, not wanting to provoke whatever was behind that wood. I left my room without thinking. I didn't turn my light on. I moved in the dark, guided by the faint kitchen glow, my feet cold against the floor. By the time I reached the hallway, my father was standing about an arm's length from the forbidden door. He wasn't blocking it so much as positioning himself as the first thing it would meet if it opened. My mother had risen from the couch and was now in the living room doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles looked pale. The hallway felt narrower than usual. The air was colder, but not evenly. The cold seemed concentrated around the door, as if it radiated from the gap beneath it. The handle moved again, slowly, with a careful patience that made my stomach twist. It pressed down a fraction, released, pressed again, learning the resistance. My father didn't take his eyes off it. "You don't get to," he said, and his voice sounded older than it had ever sounded. "You don't get to do that." A pause. Then something tapped from the other side. Not the familiar 3 knocks, but a single decisive knock directly behind the handle, like an answer. My throat tightened. My hands began to shake. My father leaned slightly forward, as if he was listening through the wood, then stopped himself and straightened again. The movement looked practiced, like he'd learned a rule about distance. My mother whispered, "Don't." She wasn't speaking to him. She was speaking to the moment. From behind the door, the murmur began again. At first it was just sound, low and indistinct, like someone speaking with their mouth too close to fabric. Then it shifted into something almost structured, a rhythm, a pattern of syllables. And under it something I recognized with a jolt that felt like nausea, my father's name. Not said correctly, not fully, but close enough to scrape across my nerves. My father flinched. Just a tiny tightening around the eyes. He didn't look at my mother. He didn't look at me. He kept staring at the handle, as if that was the only real thing in the hallway. "It's not him," my mother said, her voice breaking on the last word. The murmuring stopped. Silence thickened. Then the voice came again, clearer, slower, as if adjusting. "Dad." It wasn't my voice. Not exactly. It was a rough approximation, a sound shaped like the word, but wrong in the way a recorded song sounds wrong when played at the wrong speed. The pitch was slightly off. The timing was too careful. It sounded like someone assembling the word piece by piece. My skin erupted in goose flesh. Heat flushed my face. My eyes watered without permission. My father's jaw clenched. "Don't use that," he said. The handle pressed down further than it had before. A slow, steady pressure, as if something on the other side had decided it was time to stop practicing and start acting. The latch inside the door made a longer, harsher sound, metal sliding, a mechanism yielding. My mother made a small sound in her throat, half gasp, half sob. My father moved fast now, not to the handle. He didn't touch it. He grabbed the chair and dragged it forward, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and wedged it at an angle under the handle as if he was trying to create a second resistance point. The noise was abrupt and ugly in the quiet hallway. The door shuddered once, a subtle vibration that traveled through the floorboards. It wasn't a slam. It was pressure applied from the other side and met by the weight of the chair. I realized then, with a cold clarity, that the door was not locked in any normal way. It had never been locked. The rule wasn't don't open it because it was secured. The rule existed because if you opened it, you would be the one removing the last intentional barrier. My father's eyes flicked toward me for the first time. "Back," he said, and his voice was sharp enough to cut. Now, I didn't move. My legs felt glued to the floor. My chest felt tight, lungs refusing a full breath. My mother stepped toward me, her face wet, and grabbed my arm. Her hand was icy. She pulled me backward into the living room doorway, not gently, not roughly, just with the desperation of someone who couldn't afford to be careful. "Go," she whispered. "Go to your room and close the door and do not come out." "What is it?" I asked, and the question came out thin, almost childlike. My mother's mouth trembled. She looked past me, not at me. "It's what we kept shut," she said. In the hallway, the handle twisted. Not down this time. Sideways, like something was testing the limits of the hardware, not the latch. The metal squealed faintly. The sound was wrong in our apartment, too raw, too intimate. My father braced himself with one hand on the wall, keeping his other hand away from the door, like touching it would complete something. His shoulders were rigid. Sweat shone on his forehead in the kitchen light. The voice behind the door changed again. This time it was my mother, or something wearing her tone. "Open," it said softly. "Please open. I'm stuck." My mother let out a broken sound. She covered her mouth and shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. The voice continued, careful, persuasive, using the rhythm of a plea. "It's cold. I can't, please." My father's face hardened into something like hatred, but underneath it was fear. He spoke louder now, his voice filling the hallway. "You're not her." A pause. Then, almost amused, "You know." The door shuddered again. The chair creaked under the pressure. My mother tugged me harder toward my room, but I fought her without meaning to. Not because I wanted to go to the door, because I needed to see, needed to understand the shape of the thing that had governed our lives for 7 years. I leaned into the hallway and stared at the forbidden door. In the thin strip of light under it, something changed. At first I thought it was just shadow shifting, but then I realized the gap was darkening, as if something was pressed against it from the other side, blocking what little light seeped through. Not a foot, not a shoe, something broader, closer to the floor, like a body lowering itself to look through the narrow opening. A smell reached me then. Not rot, not something theatrical. A stale, enclosed smell, like air trapped too long in a closet, mixed with a faint chemical note like old cleaning product, the kind of smell that makes you imagine dust in your throat. My father saw the change too. His eyes dropped to the gap. "Don't," he said, and the words sounded like pain. The voice behind the door stopped pleading. It started counting. 1, it said very softly. My stomach clenched. My mother's grip on my arm became crushing. 2. My father's breathing became audible. He looked down the hallway toward the front door as if measuring distance. 3. My father moved then, not toward the forbidden door, but toward the front door, fast and silent. My mother dragged me fully into the living room and shut my bedroom door behind me with her hand still on my wrist, as if closing any door might help. I stood in my room in the dark, listening, heart pounding so hard it felt like it shook my ribs. From the hallway, I heard the chain on the front door rattle. The deadbolt clicked. My father was unlocking it. "What are you doing?" my mother hissed, her voice muffled through my door. My father's reply was too quiet to hear. The voice from the forbidden door spoke again, through the wall, through the hallway, slipping into my room like a vibration. "Don't make it worse," it said in my father's voice now. Perfectly timed. perfectly shaped. My lungs seized. I backed away from my bedroom door until my calves hit the bed frame. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying street noise, distant cars, a muffled voice in the stairwell. For a moment, normal life poured into our apartment like a flood. Then the forbidden door hit. Not a knock, not a tap. A heavy, full-body impact that made the hallway wall tremble. The sound was so loud I felt it in my teeth. My mother screamed. A real scream, raw and uncontrolled, the first genuine sound of panic I had ever heard from her. There was a second impact, then a third, each one spaced with deliberate timing, like the thing behind the door was using its weight the way someone uses a tool. The chair scraped on the floor. Wood strained. The handle rattled violently. My father shouted something then. An address? A name? I couldn't tell. His voice was swallowed by the noise. Through it all, the voice behind the forbidden door spoke again, calm and close. Open, it said. Or I open. And then, above the impacts, I heard the latch finally give. A clean, decisive metallic snap. The sound of the door becoming, for the first time in 7 years, not fully closed anymore. I didn't see it open. I was in my room, staring at my own door, as if it was the last solid boundary left in the apartment. But I heard the hinge complain, a slow groan that made my skin crawl because it meant movement. It meant air changing shape. It meant the space behind the forbidden door was no longer separate. The hallway went silent. Not the normal kind. A sudden, swallowed quiet, as if the building itself had paused to listen. Then I heard my father's footsteps retreat, quick, uneven, and a sound like someone stumbling. My mother's voice came next, broken and breathless. "Don't look!" she shouted. A second later, she was at my bedroom door, fumbling with the handle, pushing it open. The hallway light behind her made her face look hollow. Her eyes were wide in a way I'd never seen, whites showing around the edges. She grabbed me with both hands now. "We're leaving," she said. "Shoes." "Now!" Behind her in the hallway, I saw only darkness where the forbidden door should have been. The kitchen light didn't reach that far anymore. It was as if the hallway had become longer, stretched, the end of it swallowed by something that didn't reflect light. From that darkness came a soft sound. Not a footstep. A familiar, gentle knocking. 3 taps. Not on the forbidden door. On the wall beside my bedroom, right at shoulder height, as if something was standing in our hallway and trying to get our attention without raising its voice. My mother froze mid-breath. Her grip tightened to the point of pain. The taps came again. 3, patient, polite. My father's voice called from the front door, urgent. "Now!" My mother pulled me forward. My legs moved without permission. We ran into the living room, past the couch, past the open front door where cold air poured in. I saw my father half in the stairwell, waving, his face twisted with fear. As we crossed the threshold, I glanced back once. The hallway was still there. The doors were still there. But the forbidden doorway at the end was not a doorway anymore. It was a dark opening that looked too deep, too still, like the inside of the building had been hollowed out. And in that opening, something breathed, slow and close, like it had all the time in the world. My father slammed the front door behind us. The sound echoed down the stairwell. We ran down the stairs, our footsteps loud and frantic. Behind us, through the door and the walls, the knocking continued, 3 taps at a time, following us down the building as if the sound could travel without needing a surface. It didn't stop until we reached the street. And even then, when we stood under the yellow glow of a streetlight, shaking, trying to decide where to go, I felt it in my bones. The apartment above us was no longer just our home. It was open. Aftermath. We didn't go back that night. We stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the 3 of us clustered together under a streetlight that flickered faintly, as if the city itself was tired. Cars passed at a distance. Someone laughed somewhere down the block. Normal sounds, absurdly loud after the sealed quiet of the apartment. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists and press them into my jacket pockets to hide it. My mother kept looking up at the building. Not at our windows, those were dark and indistinct, but at the vertical line where our apartment should have been, as if she could sense the exact place the hallway existed inside the concrete. Her breathing was shallow and fast, like she was trying not to hyperventilate. My father had his phone out, scrolling, then stopping, then scrolling again, his thumb leaving sweaty smears on the screen. "Where are we going?" I asked. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears. Too thin. Like it had come from a smaller version of me. My father didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was clipped, practical in a way that felt forced. "Somewhere it doesn't know." That sentence stayed with me. Somewhere it doesn't know. We ended up at a motel on the edge of the city, the kind of place you only notice because it's there when you need it. Low building. Harsh lighting. A lobby that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The clerk barely looked up when we checked in, his eyes glazed with disinterest that felt like a gift. No questions. No concern. Just a key and a room number. Inside the room, my mother locked the door and slid the chain into place with shaking hands. My father checked the bathroom, the closet behind the curtains. When he finished, he stood in the center of the room for a moment, looking lost, as if he didn't know what to do now that there was no hallway to guard. We sat on the beds fully dressed. None of us slept. Every sound outside the room made my muscles tense. Footsteps on the walkway. A car door slamming. The ice machine down the hall. Each noise felt like it could become something else if I listened too closely. I pressed my palms flat against the mattress to feel something solid and real. At some point, my mother started to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet, steady leaking of sound that she tried to contain with her hand over her mouth. My father moved to sit beside her, put an arm around her shoulders. His face was blank, stretched thin, like he had already spent all the reactions he had available. I watched them and felt something shift inside me. For years, I had thought of the forbidden door as a rule my parents imposed, something they controlled. Standing there in that motel room, listening to my mother cry and my father breathe like he was counting each inhale, I understood the truth. They hadn't been in charge. They had been holding. In the early hours of the morning, when exhaustion finally dulled the sharpest edge of fear, my father spoke. He didn't tell a story. He didn't give me a clear explanation. What he gave me was fragments, careful and incomplete, as if even speaking about it carried risk. He said the apartment hadn't always been ours. He said when they first moved in, before I was born, there had been renovations planned. Walls opened. Spaces reconfigured. He said the door was supposed to be temporary. A seal, while something else was addressed. It wasn't meant to be permanent, he said quietly. Just managed. My mother wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. Her eyes were red and swollen, but there was something resolute in them now, like fear had burned down to something harder. They told us it was safe as long as it stayed closed, she said. They said it didn't understand. Not really. Who? I asked. My father's jaw tightened. The people who left it there. That was all he would say. We didn't go back to the apartment the next day, or the day after that. My father called his job and said there was a family emergency. My mother didn't go in at all. They made plans in whispers, looking at maps and listings on my father's phone, avoiding certain words, avoiding looking at each other too long. On the third day, my father went back alone. He told us he needed documents. Clothes. Things that mattered. He said he wouldn't be long. My mother begged him not to go. I didn't say anything. I just watched him, memorizing the way he tied his shoes, the crease between his eyebrows that only appeared when he was afraid but trying not to be. When he came back hours later, his face was gray. He didn't sit down. He didn't take his jacket off. He stood just inside the motel room and shook his head once, slowly. "It's not a door anymore," he said. My mother made a small, broken sound. He said the hallway felt longer. He said sound behaved wrong. He said when he stood near where the door had been, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something that didn't belong indoors. He said he didn't hear knocking. He heard breathing. We moved within a week. Different city. Different building. Different layout. No long hallways. No unexplained doors. My parents checked every wall, every closet, every access panel before signing anything. The new place was smaller, brighter, less quiet. It should have felt safe. It mostly did. But some habits don't disappear just because the danger does. My parents still flinched at unexpected knocks. My father still checked locks twice. My mother still avoided standing in doorways as if thresholds themselves had become suspect. And I found myself listening for patterns in sound, for intention hidden in ordinary noise. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake with the sense that someone was standing just outside my room, not inside, not trying to come in, just there, waiting. The feeling would fade if I turned on the light, but the echo of it stayed in my chest. We never spoke about the forbidden door again. Not directly. But once, months later, I overheard my parents talking quietly in the kitchen of the new apartment. The window was open. Street noise filtered in. Life went on indifferent. "I don't think it followed," my mother said. My father was silent for a long moment. "I don't think it needs to," he replied. I understood then that whatever had been behind that door was not bound by the apartment in the way we had been. The door hadn't been a prison. It had been a point of contact, a place where two spaces touched. And once something learns you exist, learns your voices, your rhythms, your names, it doesn't forget just because you move. Even now, years later, I can't stand having doors behind me when I sleep. I keep my bedroom door closed, but I angle my bed so I can see it clearly. I avoid apartments with strange layouts. I never ignore knocking, but I never answer it immediately either. I listen first. Always. Sometimes, when I walk down a hallway late at night and the building is quiet, I imagine I can feel it again. That subtle pressure in the air, like a pause waiting to be filled. Like something just on the other side of a surface, deciding whether to make itself known. And every time I pass a door that doesn't quite belong, a door that feels heavier than it should, I hear my father's voice in my head, steady and afraid. "Not now,"